I call the meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the May 6th, 2024 study session of the Ashland City Council. We have two items on our agenda this evening, the wildfire season preparation review and the water treatment plant update. Alyssa, do I have anyone for public input? No. So we will go ahead and get started with the wildfire season preparation review.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, Rob Sartain, Fire Chief for Ashland Fire and Rescue. With me is Mark Shea, our Fire Marshal, and Kelly Burns, our Emergency Manager. And tonight we're just going to be covering the season preparation, what we're kind of expecting looking at the fire season, and what we've done to prepare for fire season this year, some updates on the logging, and I think that's pretty much it. And then we'll take a bunch of questions from you if you have any. All right, so what we're going to start with is our firefighting resource availability. As you're aware, fire season will begin June 1st. We've been pretty much assured that that's when it will begin. I had just come from the Oregon Fire Chiefs Conference and the Fire Defense Board Chiefs meeting on Monday of last week. Right now, with the prediction for the fire service, we're going to have a late fire season versus an early fire season. All the water resources right now are showing that we are in good shape from Reading to Roseburg. The north part of Washington and the east part of the Cascades does not have the same availability with a high fire presence. Because of that, they have not, the Oregon Department of Forestry has not requested a dedicated air tanker to be stationed in Medford because right now the water propensity is quite good for us. With that also, they will be replacing the heavy tanker from the Oregon Department of Forestry with 2 helicopters that will be stationed in Medford. And before I kick that off, this is a reminder to invite the council to our Ashland Fire and Rescue open house on May 31st from 2 to 6. So come take a look at your fire station and your staff. So just a quick updates on what we were doing at the fire department and some of the things that you guys have helped us accomplish. Our new Type 6 will be being delivered in June, which is our brush rig. And then we'll be donating our 14-year-old brush rig to a volunteer fire department who has a budget of under $120,000 for their entire fire department. And that'll be a local or a fire resource that'll stay within the state. We will be receiving our Type 3, which is our heavy brush engine from the Oregon Department of Forestry. There were some setbacks on it, but we're scheduled to take delivery of that in June. Well, with getting our ambulance that was damaged in an accident, we'll be back in June, which will put our fleet back to full. And then in July, with the advent of the single role phase 3, we'll be picking up our van for the single role EMS providers. And along with preparation, well, this doesn't sound like the right place for it, but because of all the work that you did to help us with the single role EMS providers, June 8th, we'll be launching 2 more ambulances. And so that will keep more of our firefighting resources available as our single role EMS providers will be doing our transports. So that'll also increase our availability of staffing and reduce the amount of availability of our calls. Additionally, we applied for and received the Oregon State Fire Marshal's upstaffing grant for $35,000, and with that we will be adding extra staff to try to keep our minimums at 9, which is where we've been fighting to try to get to, as well as on red flag days and high wind events. We will upstaff 2 additional engine companies or 2 brush companies, and that will be mandatory staffing to protect our community, paid for by funds from the State Fire Marshal's Office. We're working with the State Fire Marshal's Office and our regional partners to help re-secure those funds next year, because as of right now they are not secured for the state as a whole, and this has been a very valuable asset for the entire state. As far as additional staffing for the valleys that you guys are usually interested in, the U.S. Forest Service will begin being staffed 7 days a week by June. With the Rogue River Hot Shots will be available by June. Our Siskiyou Repellers will be available June 4th. Our tanker base will be staffed with the federal resources beginning on June 1st, and we'll have 8 complex IMTs available, beginning with Type 1 and Type 3 for large complex fires. From the Bureau of Land Management, they'll be fully staffed beginning June with 50 additional staff members. The fuel crews will be fully staffed. There will be 12 prescribed burns prior to the fire season beginning for the BLM area. And they'll have 100, they have, one of their biggest complaints right now that they've made us aware of is that they have 140 abandoned vehicles that have been torched off or in various stages of decay in large areas of the forest that they're worried about people setting them on fire. So they're going to do what they can to try to get those 140 vehicles out of our area. Let's see what else. The Oregon Department of Forestry will have standard full staffing beginning in June. They have 17 detection cameras which are online, 5 alert wildfire cameras which are online. The Type 2 helicopters will be available in Grants Pass and Medford. A Type 3 helicopter with an 8-person air attack crew will be staffed in Medford. Our one seat will be available, which in Roseburg, which that seat is a small engine aircraft. So we'll be stationed in Roseburg, which normally we have 2. There'll be only 1 right now in Southern Oregon. Dispatch hours will be 0700 to 2200 hours for ODF. And they will rely on federal allocation of 23 large air tankers assigned to the Northwest region for resources if we need them. There will be 3 ODF incident management teams also available beginning June 1st. And then that pretty much concludes the availability of all the resources in the valley. So as you can hear from that, there is a lot of resources being brought to bear on Southern Oregon available for us to recall if we need it. Sir.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah, thanks. Ralph, Chief, this is really great, but there's so much, there's no way I could capture it all. I would wonder if you could just share your notes with us so we have kind of like a rundown of all that. It's really great information to
Absolutely.
really
I can do that for you.
take advantage. Thank you.
Councilor Hyatt?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief. Sorry
Absolutely.
to pepper you with questions right off the bat.
Absolutely.
The assets available are considerable, and I'm super grateful. But saying that, fire season we're expecting will be a late fire season, and those assets, like the tanker, specifically the large plane, not being in Medford this year, are they going to consider moving it to support us later in the season? Or is that a case of as needed based on what develops over the course of the season throughout the state?
It will be based on what develops over the course of the season, because right now the long-range projections are there is, I don't mind them pushing it further and further out. The fire season will get more advanced for us because the closer it gets to October and our rains, the happier I'm going to be.
Okay.
So I don't mind them not having an assignment right now, because that tells me that the beginning part of the fire season, they're not as concerned for Southern Oregon as they are more north of us and more east of us. So they will keep watching it. We have regular meetings, and I'm hopefully optimistic for a good fire season this year.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Councilor Dale?
Thank you. Chief, just to close the loop on that, where are they basing the tanker?
I'm sorry?
Where are they basing the tanker?
So ODF did not prescribe, so the Forest Service, or BLM will be putting a fire tanker in Medford, but ODF will not be. They're going to bring in 2 helicopters instead. So instead of having 1 air attack or 1 tanker that's dedicated for Southern Oregon, we're going to have 2 helicopters. And as far as where they put that, they don't tell us what the contract is that they signed.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So,
Go ahead.
And with that, I will turn over to Fire Marshal Shea for the wildfire mitigation stuff.
Good evening. As far as wildfire mitigation and preparedness, this evening we'll cover a helicopter logging update, an update on the CWPP, talk about weed abatement process, CERT training, the Ashland Wildfire Mitigation Project, some green debris drop-off days, and finally some outreach and education. Starting off with the helicopter logging update, the photo that you see is an actual photo of our landing and log decks at Siskiyou Mountain Park, where we began the helicopter logging project. Generally speaking, the project has been going well. It's been going according to budget and timeline. It was paused for about a week because the helicopter had to leave for some FAA certifications for firefighting this summer. We were in contact with the leadership at the company, and there was nothing that they could do about the helicopter leaving because the FAA scheduled these inspections, and if they wanted to use it for firefighting, they had to meet those inspections. So helicopter is back in town today and is scheduled to resume work tomorrow in Siskiyou Mountain Park, where we have about 25 acres left of the 147 acres that we began treating. That'll take about 3 days to finish the park. All of the logs that we've cut so far have been sent to the mill. That's 56 truckloads. And if we have not already, we should be receiving a check from those logs for $141,800 so far, with clearly more logs to be sent to the mills. We're also shipping the biomass to the mill in White City, as Chris had previously discussed, and being compensated for that. I don't have the exact current dollar figure on that. Somewhere in the middle of the timber, like you see on the picture, that we can sell to the mill, and the biomass that we can sell to the local mill in White City are small ends, pieces of logs that are not necessarily marketable. We were able to send that to the Jackson County Fuel Committee. So we sent about 40 yards of pieces that we couldn't sell to the Fuel Committee, and that will go to low-income folks that need firewood in the community. We got some support from the parks staff with a staff person and a dump truck to help us accomplish that. Trails in Siskiyou Mountain Park are currently open, and Lomacotzi is working on piling up the small limbs and small treetops for later burning of that green debris. They're also working with a biologist on habitat enhancements for the Pacific fisher and Humboldt martin currently, and developing a replanting plan for the park for potential replanting of trees this fall. Logging will, end of this week, probably Thursday or Friday, move to city forest lands south of Lithia Park in the lower watershed, and we'll begin working in critical areas right at the kind of the city border and around the water treatment plant. That phase of the project should be or is scheduled to be completed before the Memorial Day holiday, allowing for the trails to be open for the Memorial Day holiday.
So before you move on,
Yeah.
and this may be too far in the weeds, and just say that if it is.
Okay.
But one of the things that when Chris came, he was talking about was that with the climate projections being what they are, that we're looking at Douglas fir not surviving over a certain elevation. And so when we think about what we plant in the wake of this this harvest, how are we taking into consideration the likely future habitat availability or likelihood of those trees surviving? What are we planting?
What we are planting is, it's a combination of pine and oak, and the plan hasn't been fully solidified yet. I know that Chris is leaning heavily on those biologists with Lomacotzi, and that's all part of the grant project, but I know that he's going to collaborate with them to make sure that it's sustainable. We are also looking to, after the project is complete and all the logs are off of the land, to reevaluate the land to see where we are, what improvements we made, and what projections that we can make for the future for potential die-off. So to answer your question, that is something that we're taking into account and working with those scientists to make sure that we plant sustainable trees.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hanson.
Thanks, Mayor, and thank you, Marshall. I have a couple quick questions about the timeline of the logging project. I was just scrolling back through my pictures trying to find the first time I actually saw the helicopter flying. Do you remember that date off the top of your head?
I don't.
Anybody else in the room remember that?
Remember the date.
I remember the email. And
Well,
the photos.
so from my perspective, I've seen more delays than the one FAA one you're referring to, and I appreciate the efforts by all to try to speed up progress on the timeline. And I know it's a logging, it's also construction, it's all these things, the schedules and whatnot. It seems like it's way behind, and the trail users are looking at this May 27th, Memorial Day, banking on some things here. So a couple questions. What happens if we don't hit that May 27th deadline where we're not done yet? What's going to happen to the project and all the fuels on the ground? First question.
That would probably be a better question that I need to pose to Chris. and get a better answer for you. I think Chris would be able to provide a good answer to that question.
Okay. Yeah, because so far we're talking about the 140 acres or so at Siskiyou Mountain Park, but we have like hundreds and hundreds of acres beyond that in the watershed that we're going to tackle next. And with only less than a month, it just doesn't add up.
Well, I think the focus is to clear the trail areas so they're back open and then move further away from the trails.
Gotcha.
So
I'm looking
I
at
also,
total
you know,
project completion. Not
Yeah,
just
we recognize
Band-Aids.
that this is a big priority for the community, and council has, allocated the money for it, so we're confident that we can get through this project. And hopefully there will be no more delays, but, magic 8 ball involved.
Well, my second part of the question is, I guess we don't know that, but it's a concern. What happens if we don't get done by Memorial Day? And then the second question I have is, as a casual observer, but, weekly trail user, I haven't seen log trucks picking logs up out of the forest from more traditional roadside methods. Is that being implemented, and when is that going to be implemented? Driving through the loop road, you see all the trees down, but they're there. They're still there.
Right. All the logs so far have come from Siskiyou Mountain Park, and the helicopter brings them to the landing where they're processed and decked there, and then they go directly from there out. So they've only come from the one location at the landing at Siskiyou Mountain Park.
So is there going to be a coordinated effort from the roads to pick up all that other timber that's been felled? Is that how I say it?
Yeah.
Around the loop road?
Yep, that's going to be in the second phase here.
Okay.
Counselor Kaplan?
Just on that, I mean, my understanding was all of it was going to be dropped by picked up by the helicopter from both locations and dropped at those two landing spots. So there's not going to be the traditional truck traffic on Loop Road that you're talking about. But maybe I've misunderstood what Chris said before.
No, it is all picked up by the helicopter and taken to two different landings. And then from those landings, the log truck will remove it.
So there's no landing.
I hope there's some roadside, more traditional operations going on. It seems like such a huge project, and with this timeline that's been going on, it's concerning. As a community member and a trail user, I'm rooting for you, but I don't. That's all I guess of the questions I have, but it's concerning, and I hope that there's more traditional extraction besides the helicopter, because we just have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time left. That's all. Thanks.
I have a follow-up question behind Counselor Hanson. In the past, when we get to fire season, it changes what can be done out in the woods in terms of mechanical, machinery and all that. What can be fired up and used? Is kind of back to that question of, if it's not done by the end of May and we come into fire season on June 1st, does that essentially halt what's happening? Do we get kind of stuck?
No, if we're not complete and fire season occurs, there are mitigation efforts, mitigation measures that we can take, or the contractor, can take to continue to work. So we either fire and rescue and or Oregon Department of Forestry, we can require additional fire suppression measures. They have a tank with water, folks ready to fight fire. They conduct fire watch. So after they're finished with their operations, they have to remain and watch the area for a certain set amount of time. Because it's early enough in the season, we'd be able to do that.
Counselor Duquesne.
Thank you, Mayor. And something that I think, Chiefs, you mentioned that fire season has been pushed back.
Right,
So
and
do
that's-
you, yeah. can you
Yeah, and that's what I was
speak
going to say, Mayor, is even though fire season is going to begin on June 1st, that doesn't mean all of the fire protection, it goes into effect with all the reductions in what you're allowed to do in timeframes. Because really, in 3.5 weeks, this is, unless something drastically changes in our water and our heat, we are not going to be in a fire protection where we're having to stop any type of flame producing logging or anything like that, or weed cutting, trimming, or anything like that. So we will have time once fire season begins before the protection levels lower.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Okay. Moving on to our CWPP update and reminder, the CWPP is the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. This update is funded by a USDA Forest Service grant. We're well underway with the update. We have our hired consultant. We have many public groups that we're seeking, work groups we're seeking public participation from, and staff is working hard on the update. The project is going to be ongoing throughout the year. We started the project with a contract with Rogue Reconnaissance, the drone company that we use for drone surveys of the watershed in the summer. They conducted an assessment of the entire city using LiDAR technology. We're going to use that as our base risk assessment for this document, which is a lot different than the current document where the risk assessment was done essentially at a street level by several individuals, and it had some subjectivity to it. This is going to have a lot less subjectivity. So right now, staff is working to essentially take that data from the LiDAR and the drone assessment and determine how we're going to put that into the final document. The CWPP, we're coordinating with two research projects, one with Oregon State University and the other with Boise State University. So we have some of their faculty available at our disposal as we move through this process. Those representatives from the universities are going to be seeking feedback from community members regarding their perception of wildfire risk and evacuation preparedness. They're going to be conducting research and studies that they're going to share their academic reports with us as well. Moving on to weed abatement, we'll begin mailing notices to known identified hazard properties on June 1st. The process will be standardized. Each property will initially receive an educational letter. If they fail to comply, they'll then receive a pre-citation letter. If they continue to fail to comply, they'll receive a citation and abatement. The time difference between that first letter and that potential citation or abatement is, generally speaking, 1 month. We've increased our collaboration with the city code enforcement officer to make sure that we have a more collaborative and consistent approach to code enforcement issues across the city. And we're going to begin tracking dates that complaints were made, compliance time, and location of those properties that have been more of an identified hazard, so that in the future we can be more efficient with weed abatement earlier in the season.
So one of the things that has come up in terms of weed abatement in the past is the lands that are not within the city limits, that are either county land, or I know a couple of years ago we had an issue with the railroad not dealing with their weeds over by the Wingspread Mobile Home Park. And so is there anything that we need to be thinking about in terms of those lands right around our municipal boundaries that don't have a weed abatement requirement because they're, say, out in the county, or these intrusions with the railroad? Is there anything that we need to do as a municipal government to expand our reach into those areas that pose that kind of danger?
I think that's a challenge, and I don't know that we have the ability to expand our reach beyond those municipal borders for a privately owned property. If we're looking essentially at a railroad right-of-way, or a property maybe owned by a business or another, like maybe the county, for example, we can persuade them through letters explaining our ordinance and asking for compliance, but it's difficult to to gain compliance when they're not within the city.
Right. Well, and I know that just as a follow-up, several years back before the Alameda fire, the city had requested to the county that for some amount of area around our municipal boundaries that we would be able to have kind of a transition zone where we could enforce that. And I don't think it went anywhere, but I don't believe we've asked since the Alameda fire. Is that something we should ask about again?
That's what I was going to say, Mayor. Remember, we started working on that and it kind of went away with COVID and everything else like that, so it got ground to a halt. So I think that you and the elected officials with Talent in Phoenix and Medford, who have a Central Point, who have unincorporated areas that butt up to their cities, it would be an elected official discussion with the county commissioners, again, to bring that back up. It's not anything that we can do from the fire service. The fire chiefs, I'm pretty sure, would be in support of anything we can do to protect our community, our municipal communities. But that would be a discussion at an executive level with the county commissioners to enforce a county ordinance to allow for a small gap. I mean, a blanket, as you're well aware, a blanket countywide weed ordinance would never fly, but maybe something like we've talked about of 300, 500 feet within the area of the city that can be enforced in that area might be something we might be able to get through at an elected level.
Right, that was exactly, I was wondering if this body and me in particular had a role to play here. Great. Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you, Mayor. The mayor just brought up the wing spread area. And I did have one of the residents that I believe lives in that area ask me about the house that's on Clay and Villard. It's owned by the city and it's fenced. And there's tons of weeds. And when we talk about weed abatement June 1st, is that going to be mitigated, gone away June the 1st? It looks pretty bad. It's city
Our-
property and,
Yes.
And Scott is also welcome to come up if Scott has an answer for us.
everybody come on up, yeah.
So on city-owned properties, we do go out and do weed abatement before the deadline. So usually we have the county crews or our own crews go out and do weed abatement on our own properties. The airport is an example, 380 Clay Street's an example. There are rights-of-way that we do that work as well.
Is that June 1st or when is that?
June
Scott?
15th, I think, is
Okay,
the
so I
weed
can tell
abatement date, yes.
Okay, thank you.
June 1st is just when we're beginning to notify folks that enforcement will occur.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Hyatt.
To continue on the theme, my question is just around where we have easement. So if it's a county private property, but yet the city has easement, do you have any recourse with regard to weed abatement? And similarly with the railroad, since the railroad has right-of-way through town, do we have any recourse because of the right-of-way? And essentially their easement on our property?
Really? That question tonight, huh?
Wishful thinking, or maybe?
No, so it takes a little bit of
Chief,
work
if you
with the
can get
railroad.
in a little closer there.
It does take a little bit of work with the railroad, but they did comply once we started pushing the issue, which we were hoping to start earlier this year with the railroad department. As far as easement, honestly, Counselor, I have no idea. That would be a legal question because that's not something that has.
Here he
ever been
comes
posed.
again.
Let Scott deal with it.
So if the city has an easement on private property, we have approved access to that easemented area for our infrastructure. And potentially, in order to gain access to that infrastructure, we could do some weed abatement and some site cleaning to provide that access. I haven't had much experience in my time here dealing with that, but as long as the easement's granted to the city, that's something that we can access and do.
Excellent, thank you.
Moving on to CERT training, we are currently utilizing the decommissioned fire battalion chief vehicle as the CERT vehicle. It replaces a vehicle that was an old ambulance well beyond its service life. We've done some recent CERT training where we have certified more volunteers to drive the CERT vehicle. And we've also done some increased CERT training to provide training for the CERT volunteers to provide firefighter rehab on fires that'll free up fire-trained personnel to conduct firefighting operations as opposed to rehab operations. And we have 10 volunteers that are trained at that level currently. And then finally, on CERT, we have an annual evacuation refresher that'll occur in June in collaboration with emergency management and the police department.
Can you define firefighter rehab activities?
Yeah, firefighter rehab, during a firefighting event, right, it's a physically demanding event, and so there are required times when firefighters have to rest during that event. And essentially rehab is ensuring that the firefighters are hydrated, are cooled down, have a baseline set of vital signs that are acceptable to return to firefighting and are not going to cause them any medical issues.
Great, thank you.
The Ashland Wildfire Mitigation Project is the large FEMA grant that we're working with. In the past several months prior to my arrival in the position and during my time here, we've been unable to fill the vacant wildfire risk reduction specialist position with a candidate that was able to perform all of the job duties that we were looking for, which were site visits, interacting with the public, conducting assessments, and processing federal paperwork. So it's a kind of a wide range of duties. What we've done is we're utilizing a part-time temporary employee who is helping us get through the backlog of the federal paperwork. And Brian Hendricks is working on assessments and coordinating with the public on this. That's brought us to a point where we are closing out all of our old projects, and this month we're going to be able to begin opening new projects at probably a rate of 3 to 5 a month to begin with, due to staff capacity and really getting used to reopening these projects, because in my 6 months here, we have only closed projects, we haven't opened any. So we'll begin opening projects again. To date, we have 155 properties mitigated, and including 11 wood shingle roof replacements. This grant period ends March 2025.
Councilor Bloom.
Hi, thank you. Actually, my question is previous slide. I was typing notes, so I didn't get to the last part about the annual evacuation exercise in June. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and is there community involvement in it? Do we have any role to play?
I can answer a little bit of that. So CERT has been doing an annual evacuation drill with their teams for several years, more than a few years, more than I've been involved with it. And it is just a team exercise, but we are specifically doing the exercise in a residential area that abuts up to some commercial areas. And when they go out and do their things, if people approach them and they're like, hey, this is what we're doing, we're assessing this. Have you thought about, how are you going to get out? Do you know your routes? And they're going to be gathering data on that. I'm going to be partnering with law enforcement on this one too, because ultimately if we do have a mass evacuation in town, law enforcement's going to be in charge of that. And so they're going to be familiar with what CERT does in their exercise. But technically it's just for CERT, but if people engage with them, then they'll tell them all about it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Councilor Duquesne?
So I don't know if now is the time. I was kind of going to wait till we got to that area. Should I wait until you are up the mic, or should I just jump in?
So for more evacuation questions,
Yeah,
those are coming
I'll wait.
later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are coming later.
Yeah, I'll wait.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah, thanks. On that, thanks very much, Kelly, for explaining the annual evacuation exercise. I wonder if it would be, it's because it's in June, we've got some time, some lead time. It's an issue that's of a lot of interest within the community, and I understand that it's really a CERT, exercise but it may be, it seems to me it'd be useful to have a bit more information for the community about that. Maybe an article, maybe something in the newsletter. Is that something that our city staff would have capacity to push out?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I have a question back to the FEMA grant project. So if memory serves, that project is looking to mitigate 1,100 properties. And it has a deadline of March 2025. And I remember working on this before I even came on council, and so it's been a while. That timing of less than 10 started per month makes me look at the March 2025 deadline and wonder how does this connect together, and what happens when we get to March 2025 and we haven't spent it? Is there a way to allocate it or to do something in some sort of a way so that we don't lose that funding? And then the second question is, what can we do to get on a faster pace?
So the biggest thing to try to get on a faster pace, and that's a great question, is we need to be able to have a dedicated employee. When we began the process, we've been through 2 employees. One that, because this is only a temporary position, it's not a full-time job. The person who initially started it and was doing a great job and was increasing the pace left to go to the U.S. Forest Service for a full-time job. We replaced him with another person who could do the job, and she made it about 6 weeks, and then she had a family emergency and was unable to continue. So we just finished training her and getting ready to turn her loose. And then we went through 3 hiring processes, and we were unable to get anybody. So we've been scrambling to try to find a way to do this project internally without adding any additional resources, because we just have not had qualified applicants to do this. So our biggest problem right now is having a staff member that we can dedicate full-time to this, that can do this type of work. If we can find that would be amazing. We could get this going a lot faster. But to answer your question, when it gets to March 25, we are allowed to ask for an extension. But it's basically, we're going to have to look at what we're actually accomplishing for the city, what the amount of resource drain is on the fire department, and if we can't try and find one more testing process to do this, then we'll have to make a decision as the department and as the city as whether or not to extend this, as it's just not really conducive to protect our city.
So I think when we were talking about this on the commission years ago, we were recognizing that 1,100 out of the 7,000 and something structures in the community was really important to get that anchor amount of wildfire risk reduction handled. Because we haven't been able to have people in that position consistently, does that create the possibility of potentially having 2 people, one who specializes on the paperwork end and one who specializes on the outreach and getting projects started? Is there something that we can do within the budget to get to where we have as many projects in place by March of 2025 as possible, so that we have a better leg to stand on in terms of asking for more time?
Well, we've been trying to find every possible way to try to staff this, and Mark has come up with some creative ways to get to where we are now. But the biggest thing is being able to just get somebody interested that we can have that works with the community, because it is it's representing the city of Ashland at people's homes and telling them what to do, and then we have to specially train them to do wildfire assessments and mitigation efforts, and so it's trying to find that rounded person is very difficult, and that's what right now we have spread it out, where we are now taking Brian away from a lot of his duties, because he is so good at assessments and risk mitigation and everything else, and getting him out. And then we hired a temporary employee to do the paperwork, who we stole from
Utility
billing. So she was a temporary employee for utility billing, and then she does not want full-time employment, but we were able to take her from utility billing and use her in that role to fill the paperwork. So we're doing that. We just don't have a dedicated person that we can come in on the backside to try and help do the mitigation work that Brian's currently doing. And by him doing this, we're taking him away from other duties in the city that's just as important.
Councilor Dale?
Thank you. Thank you all. And just kind of to linger on what the mayor was saying. So can you elaborate a bit on what keeps, if anything, is there a trend of what keeps tripping up the hiring the applicant process? Do they keep tripping up on the same thing? Is it, I mean, kind of to the mayor's point about dividing that, or is it, can we change what the requirements are? I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here, that we just keep having an applicant.
I wish I could say that there was one specific thing, because if I could say that there was one specific thing, it just, unfortunately, like I don't know, there's not really a nice way to say it. The quality and quantity of the applicant pool has just not been there.
Fair enough.
So if we could find one specific thing, I'd be more than happy to eliminate something and change it to make it work.
Understood.
Counselor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Can you explain the relationship of this work to the volunteers that are participating in the RAP assessments? Because I thought it was a relatively similar assessment that's being done, and if that's actually additional human resources to put into it. They're volunteers, they're not a full-time staff, but there's more of them.
It's a relatively similar assessment. The RAP volunteers they're handling lower acuity, if you will, assessments that are more giving recommendations as opposed to tied to federal funding and reimbursements. I'm going to touch on kind of where the RAP program here is momentarily, and there has been a pause or a delay in their conducting assessments because of getting software for the assessments up online. So that is something that we can approach, is training more of those RAP assessors to the FEMA criteria so that they can start making these assessments on these properties.
So that is potentially feasible. It sounds
Yes.
like that may address part of our human resource problem.
Yeah.
At least on the assessment side, not on the bureaucracy side.
Correct.
So one last question before we move on from this. Initially, when the program was first starting, there was a conversation about the fact that some of our lower income folks, because they have to front the money and then they get reimbursed from FEMA or from our grant money, that might push some of them out of the ability to take advantage of this project, even though they fall within that 1,100 highest risk homes. I've had some conversations with local banks. I know that there's interest in potentially figuring out some sort of a bridge loaning process, particularly for those folks. To what extent do you think that is needed? Have you come across that yet? How important is it that we work with our local banks to try to get some sort of a program in place for this particular project?
I could see that as beneficial. In my time, my few short months with the program, I've just been addressing trying to close out all of the open applications and projects and getting folks refunded the money that they're out. Looking forward, as we begin to reopen projects, that is something that we can approach, and I think would be helpful to those more needy citizens.
Great, thank you.
Moving on to green debris drop-off days. We've conducted 2 of these so far in collaboration with Jackson County Emergency Management. So the dates, one happened on April 27th. One is going to happen on May 11th. Those are countywide. So wherever you live in actually Jackson or Josephine counties, there's opportunities to drop off your green debris on both of those days. For the event on April 27th, for the Ashland specific drop-off site, we saw about 100 vehicles. Those 100 vehicles dropped off about 180 cubic yards of green debris, and we're expecting a larger turnout on the May 11th event. Outreach and education for wildfire. We are continuing to coordinate social media posts geared towards wildfire preparedness throughout this month and then throughout summer. We held a wildfire season outlook and SmokeWise workshop in coordination with the Ashland Chamber on May 2nd. That was addressed to the business community. We had about 30 different businesses attend that. In collaboration with Emergency Management and Boise State University, we're going to be hosting 2 wildfire workshops. One's in person on May 8th, and the other one is virtually on May 16th. Both are 15th? Thank you, Kelly. Both are at 6 p.m. Additional Community events, Community Wildfire Education Day, Sparking Action on May 18th. That's at Science Works, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We're going to have a fire demonstration. There's going to be story time for kids related to wildfire safety. We're going to have an event for making DIY air filters, Smoky Bear, and fire engines present. Moving on to May 22nd, we'll be hosting 2 DIY air filter classes at the Ashland Senior Center. As Chief mentioned, on May 31st, we'll have an open house at Fire Station 1 from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. We'll be highlighting the services that we provide, giving station tours, giving tours of the emergency vehicles, and fire personnel engaging with the community. Then moving on to June 28th, we'll have some cleaner air classes in Spanish targeted for the Oregon Child Development Coalition and those families. And each of those families will leave with a new air purifier, which is funded by a EPA grant, EPA and Oregon State University grant. Moving from kind of the outreach to some of the RAP that I talked about. RAP has been merged into the CERT program. We currently have 18 RAP volunteers. We're rolling out a new home assessment software program. Brian has spent a considerable amount of time making sure that that software program is usable for our community. And that's going to be rolled out mid-May, so mid this month. That'll be utilized by both fire staff and RAP volunteers. There's going to be a bit of a learning curve, as there is with any new software for the volunteers. So we're expecting an initial 10 to 20 assessments per month by RAP, and then that to increase as they become more familiar with the software. We'll start out with citizens or residents that are requesting assessments, and then we'll also be doing Firewise neighborhood renewals through the RAP volunteers and with the new software. The Fire Adapted Ashland MAC is working on updates to the prohibited flammable plant list, and they'll submit those changes later this year for approval. And then finally, Oregon Department of Forestry will be soliciting feedback by way of open houses later this summer on the latest revision of the state wildfire hazard map. Fire staff will remain actively engaged in that conversation, and will collaborate with our internal city partners and stakeholders on the anticipated impacts to the city.
Great. Councillor Hyatt.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight your RAP volunteers for a moment. I know that they had come and spoken to the HOA in the subdivision where I live. They were exceptional, professional, provided information that was easy to put in action, so people were able to take that with them. I have seen them do their assessment work. They do it well. They advise in a way where you don't feel judged, which I think is really important, because it's your home and people are coming to look at it and give you recommendations. And they do it in a way that I feel is very constructive and helpful, and it gives the feeling of you have control. And that's a big deal. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize them, their professionalism, and how they go about the job.
Thank you.
We have an answer to an earlier question. Marianne let me know that the helicopter logging began April 18th, so we've had about 18 calendar days since that day for the helicopter logging.
Okay, great. So one of the questions I have is, I know we have a lot of really good information on our website about what people can do around their yards and what plants to get rid of and all of that sort of thing. But we're only going to reach a certain number of people who come to a workshop. And so is there something that we can do, and maybe this is more of a question for Sabrina with the communications folks, is there something that we can do to bring that information more directly into people's homes? I know that the latest newsletter has the events that are coming, but again, is there a way to put more direct information into the hands of people through social media, through the hard copies, that kind of thing? What can we do on that end so that people are more clear in general about what they can do, even if they haven't had a wildfire assessment?
Yeah, we can continue to do press releases directing people to resources. Not a problem.
Councillor Kaplan.
On that note, is it perhaps part of our collaboration with the school district that maybe that's another way to reach folks, families who have kids in school?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Okay.
And we're looking to refine our fire department social media presence. That will be part of it, getting this message out. And I anticipate with the public outreach with the CWPP program, we will find out how we can best meet the different populations of Ashland where they are, and will help dictate kind of the future of this messaging.
Yes. Great, thank you. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's very helpful to have that encapsulated. I know I've been getting a lot of questions coming into fire season. I'm sure the rest of the council has as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very
Yeah.
much.
I think we're all interested in making it through every single fire season just the best possible way. Council, mayor, city staff, Kelly Burns, emergency management coordinator with the city of Ashland. I'm going to go through my bulleted list of items, and hopefully I'll answer some of the questions that you're waiting to ask, but I'm also willing to ask or answer more. So with the evacuations work over the last few months to get ready for our summer months and our fire season, you'll notice that there were the 50 evacuation zone signs that have been put up. I'm trying to get another 100, and because our street department has capacity to put signs in, and I just learned this, I've been a firefighter most of my life, they're only allowed to put those evacuation zone signs up until March, and then they've got to do paving and things like that. So next year, I'm going to have their street department very busy with more evacuation zone signs. We had to coordinate with our GIS team, very talented GIS team that helped design that, Leah and Ricky Fight. And because we've attracted some attention through the county is also looking at doing a similar program. Any questions on the evacuation zone signs? Let me just go down through the bulleted list because I jumped ahead. So there's going to be some expansion to the evacuation zone maps. So our zones where there were spaces in between them now, we've kind of colored those in. That was done in coordination with Jackson County and their GIS team as well. Then we've got some regional coordination I'm going to talk about with our emergency operations center work, something that's going to support the firefighters and the cops and the street department when they're all out fighting the thing. Then how do we then support them with an emergency operations center? We have an evacuation summit that because Chief O'Mara admitted that the Almeida event was his first experience with a mass evacuation. And when we have one of those, he's likely going to be the guy in charge. Well, I like to train and I like to be good at what we're supposed to do. So I'll tell you more about our evacuation summit that we're putting together. Finally, we've expanded our capacity with coordinated messaging with our Citizen Alert, our Everbridge accounts. You can still call it Nixle. It's fine. It's the same thing. And then finally, with individual preparedness, we've got some home evacuation drills and the ongoing research projects, which you've heard a little bit about, and those are going to give us some good results. So I already talked about the signs. Do we have any questions about those?
Councillor Duquesne?
I don't have a question about the signs, so.
Oh, okay. Councillor
Yeah.
Dale?
Thank you. And yes, I've noticed that, and I'm in evacuation zone 3, so I appreciate that. And so can you just, just so everybody listening can hear, so you see a sign, what does it mean?
It is as you are entering that zone.
Right.
So as you leave it, hopefully on an opposing street or across the corner, you'll see the next zone that you might be going into. So they're placed, for me, very strategically around town. And surprisingly, 50 signs went up pretty quickly. Like they got used up pretty fast.
And so someone should know ahead of time by way of our website which roads in the event of an evacuation would be the preferred route out of that area. Is that correct?
Yeah, so our evacuation study gave us the main arteries and side streets and things too. And I'm a big proponent of self-education. If you haven't gone out and driven our streets and found side streets, like it's everybody's responsibility to do that.
Got it. Thank you.
Mayor.
Councillor Duquesne.
Thank you. So, and thank you for this. My question is, everyone knows the zone that they're in, and then being able to have that on the website, I think is great. However, in the case of an emergency and there is no Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
and there are no cell phones, and we cannot go online and see where to go, wherever this emergency might be coming from, have we ever given thought to the zone and actually having a paper copy? I know so many people who have evacuation boxes or kits or whatever, and they drive around in their car, or it's in their garage. And I was thinking, is there a way that this can be printed out? So if I'm in zone, I don't know, 4 or whatever, and is there a way that when, I don't know if it's mailing in our utilities or what have you, so that that person, individual, can put that in their kit and know their way out?
Absolutely.
I do believe in preparation also, and it's on that individual, the burden of getting out. So having that ahead of time and being able to take that drive and see what that looks like, but having it in your evacuation kit, I think is so important, because we might not have electricity.
100%, and I appreciate that. Yeah, so we do have printed flyers that have the maps on them. We've partnered with Oregon Shakespeare as well, because they have people that come from out of town that have not experienced what we've experienced in our wildfire seasons, and they have it on their for their apartments that they get put up in. They have it on their refrigerator. They also have it on their door, almost like a fire evacuation when you go to a hotel. I've approached the Chamber of Commerce too about making like a 8.5 by 11 that businesses could post in their windows, because we're not always at home. And if you walk into a business and then you see what zone you're in, potentially with a QR code that would take you to the city website that goes to the Know Your Zone map, like there's a lot more ways that we could put this front and center. And we're trying everything we can. So yeah, let's keep doing that.
I also just want to point out that it's been in the utility billing insert for the last several months, and we'll continue to include that.
I know that the zones are in there, but the route, which street do I take to get out, depending on which zone an individual is in?
So we will not tell you which route to take.
No, but what is available, because we don't know where an emergency is coming from, so we cannot say, make a left and go down this road. However, if all the opportunities, the possibilities are there, then that person or family knows this is the way out.
Yeah, currently the only way we have that is for families and individuals to try it out for themselves. We can't tell you exactly which route to take. We've got our time study, and it's got our biggest routes. And my role, coordinating with every agency in the city that has a stake in like a mass evacuation, is to try to keep that open and flowing as much as possible. So I could say individual practice. The home, it's maybe a little bit later here when I talk about home evacuation drills. I've got 3 different levels for those, and I'll break that down for you and give you an idea of what we can do with that.
Councillor Kaplan.
Yeah, I think you're asking if we have questions about signs, and we've kind of gone into other things as well. It's kind of about educating the public. It's about, keeping those evacuation routes open, all those things. I do have a question about the choke points that were really the focus of attention in the evacuation time study back in 2021. And I'm wondering, how are we doing on really relieving some of those choke points? I know that there's been a lot of work that's been doing that you've done on that, so I'd like to hear a bit more about that.
Let's go to the evacuation task force on that. So
Great.
that's an operational group within our city with Public Works, Streets, Fire, Police, and ODOT, who's a ready partner and a willing partner, because they went through Alameda with us. And so we can't say exactly what tactics we're taking, but with the help of GIS, we have identified the top 15 pinch points in town. And then just as Councilor Duquesne was saying, like, you don't know exactly where it's going to come from. But if it's coming from a certain direction and heading towards certain pinch points, then that's where we could have capacity to send personnel there to keep those pinch points open. Like, we're going to need to do more work there. And in the event of it, we're going to do our best to keep those lanes open.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
So, Kelly, you're one person, and you're the coordinator on all of this. How much of this is also involving building in some redundancy so that if you happen to be out, that there's somebody that really is there to, because nobody's going to wait for you, or an emergency is not going to wait for you to get back if you happen to be out of
My
town.
plan would be to have everybody trained up to be able to do more than and to understand all this so that, I wouldn't always have to be on duty. But my plan is to be on duty until that happens. I think I'm building redundancy at an emergency messaging level. I have key people within the city that we're training on the Everbridge system, and I'm going to be convening a class with them come June so that we can all get into the system again and practice. And it does have a little exercise mode so we don't send out a message that we're not supposed to. I hope that makes sense, because yes, I would love to have more than one person coordinating all this, but we have good people that work here. They know their capacities, and we're going to trust them to do their jobs.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with one person coordinating it, high level, and really making sure that we're, hitting all the high points. But having other people that can really step in as needed, I think, is also important.
Yeah.
Councillor Hyatt.
Thank you, Mayor. Kelly, to go back to the pinch points piece,
Sure.
I am thinking a series of those are likely not under our direct control with regard to jurisdiction. And we did learn a lot last time, especially with regard to the trucks, the 18-wheelers,
Yeah.
being rerouted through town on 99. So with that learning and those pinch points known and understanding that not everything is within our jurisdictional control, have we put together systems, processes, and procedures to navigate those situations with ODOT and similar partners going forward?
Yes, I believe we have a good plan with ODOT going forward.
And you feel that that line of communication is such that you pick up the phone and they're like, oh, it's Kelly. We're
Yeah.
getting this done.
Yeah. Yeah, or they would say it's Ralph, or they might say it's Chief O'Mara.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. One other question. I know in some other communities, they're starting to look at how do they make sure that the family members of the people who are asked to stay and direct traffic and stay with the emergency, how do we make sure that their families are taken care of so that they're not torn between staying in their post and going to help their families? Do we have any sort of a special drill or training program that will address, making sure that extra layer of support is provided?
So at the end of this month, I'm compiling kind of a short to-do list for all of our city employees. It'll be in the form of an email with a couple of resources on it, but it is talking to that very thing of like making sure that your family is prepared. Because ultimately, if we have a big event in the city or even regionally and we need people to come back in, it is preferable that, members' families are safe and have a plan and can execute that plan, and then that the employee can come back and help support the efforts. So that'll be at the end of this month, and I'm sure that the employees would want some more ongoing education as well in that too, just a little help on it. So I plan to be pushing that effort.
Councillor Kaplan?
Yeah, a couple of the points from the evacuation time study that struck me. One is that there'll be a problem with the pinch point. It's kind of the opposite of the pinch point, really. It's too much traffic through the routes. If people take more than one vehicle, evacuate with more than one vehicle, because many people have two or maybe even three vehicles, and that could really clog our arteries. That's one point. And then the others are people that don't have any vehicles, don't have a way to get out, and making sure. And I know that we've done a lot to train, I think, public works staff to be able to drive buses so that we can actually take advantage of all the buses that we may have around town.
Yeah, we're still working on that.
Still working on that. But so I wonder if there's, you can talk about the work to help the people who don't actually have an access to a vehicle for getting out.
There's a big effort in emergency management right now to help those with access and functional needs or limited mobility. We're doing drills on it as well. I don't have anything on paper yet. I have a project that OSU approached us about. As I go towards, let's see, let's jump around here. It's not part of the BSU research project, but there was a proposal from OSU about incorporating autonomous vehicles to make access and a mass evacuation to people with access and functional needs. So they're going for a grant, and I wrote a letter of support for that. I'm meeting with the researcher this Thursday, and we're going to talk about whether or not they're going to get funded for that. Yeah, it makes my brain tumble and stuff too, but that's what really good engineers and smart people from OSU can figure out. Me, I just want it to work when it happens. It's not happening yet, but it could. And I don't have a full answer for you on other than to, if you are somebody with access and functional needs and limited mobility, then these are good months right now to figure out a plan as to, how are you going to get out? How are you going to either shelter in a safe place or find your way to make an evacuation? And yes, the school bus idea with city employees and potentially Shakespeare employees is one way that we can do that, especially working with the disaster registry through the city of Medford and the Rogue Valley Council of Governments. And that information is pushed out to our responders on their mobile data terminals so that we can identify those locations where they're at.
Councillor Hyatt.
Thank you, Mayor. Kelly, is there any opportunity to use the Ashland Community Connect platform in identifying folks that may have those mobility issues ahead of time? Not saying that we would set up bus routes and bus stops. I'm not going that far, but knowledge is power. We do have this new tool. I don't know how highly leveraged it is right now by the community. It may be a potential resource to identify those who need that type of help.
Yeah, I want to say that the disaster registry has taken note of the Community Connect that we're doing because it does include that information.
Okay.
And I don't know, maybe Chief would be able to comment on how to bridge those two sources of information. Ultimately, we need it in the hands of our responders.
Got it.
How are we doing?
Go ahead.
All right, so we did the signs. This is the expanded zones, and in coordination with Jackson County Emergency Management and Jackson County GIS, our own Ashland GIS and myself, we colored in some of them because a lot of folks that live just on the outside of our city limits, they count too. So if we're sending an evacuation order, then we wanted to include them as well. So Jackson County Emergency Management is going to release this with part of their wildfire preparedness campaign here in the next week or so. They're just waiting on other communities around the valley that have expanded their zones or had blended their zones to finish because they need help from their GIS people. And we're just fortunate that we have a really good team here, if that makes sense. The Evacuation Task Force, we're going to be meeting again at the end of the month, and I've already talked a little bit about them. Regional cooperation, we couldn't do this without the support from our city and SOU and the Ashland School District when we created the intergovernment agreement last year to create a joint emergency operations center, a combined team that can help support in the event that we get another Alameda and we need some support for the firefighters and cops and folks that are working out in the field. And so our center is at SOU. And we've stood it up now as a warm EOC just to kind of exercise it now and then when we have big events in town, say the 4th of July or SOU commencement. We plan on doing that again this year. And then we're encouraging city staff and electeds to take those FEMA trainings and get them under your belts so that you can learn that language and the process that we need to help us take care of our folks that are out there doing the work. And we're going to be meeting again this month. We have a monthly meeting with the EOC team. That happens on every third Thursday. And because I'm a former firefighter and I like to train and I like exercises, we're starting to do more exercises, kind of like what we did recently. So the Evacuation Summit, born from Chief O'Mara's want to get trained up on it, I met a Butte County official some months ago when she gave a presentation on what she did to help coordinate the mass evacuation in the Oroville Dam disaster of 2017, followed quickly by the campfire in Paradise. And she served time in the EOCs there, and she served time in the EOC helping to get more than 120,000 people evacuated from both of those events. And I was impressed with her presentation, and I approached her, learned that her husband was a battalion chief that fought the fire in Paradise as well too. And the Almeida is near and dear to my heart because I'm like, oh, we must be the same guy. So we had some conversations, and through that, and because they're moving to Oregon, not to Ashland, sadly, I asked if they would be willing to come and work with our local responders who are still trying to figure out this mass evacuation puzzle and teach what their lessons learned were, plus what their best practices are now in Butte County. We're also going to get a visit from their sheriff. His name's Corey Honea, and he's been willing to come up and talk as well because he served in both of those and is currently still serving in his position there. So there's some strength to that. That's going to happen on July 11th. It's going to be mostly for operational folks and responders so that they can have time to talk about their own experiences, but then learn from these two keynotes. And my goal is when we leave that day is that we have some kind of written action plan for our agencies to coordinate better when we do have a mass evacuation. Questions on that? Finally, with our messaging with the county, like I work very closely with Jackson County Emergency Management and Medford and Talent. I work pretty closely now with the school district as well as SOU. They each have their own messaging platform for when we have events, and we're doing the first ever truly coordinated messages for this because, as we know, in big events, they don't pay attention to borders. It's part of the reason why we're coloring in some of the areas of our evacuation zone maps as well, too. So that's just ongoing. Ashland is a frequent user of Everbridge compared to other areas and things, too. So I'm proposing some other ideas that I've had, and I'm trying not to ruffle too many feathers because I like our Jackson County neighbors. When we have red flag days, the National Weather Service is trying out a pilot program this year of a red flag day announcement. I also wouldn't mind doing that for our local area here just to give one more little tip into the awareness of when we have hot wind blowing on hot summer days so that everybody just takes it easy and is more aware. A little more awareness is always a good thing. Questions on that?
Yep. Councilor Dale.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Kelly. I was waiting for the slide to come up. So, as a kid growing up, I remember my mother saying, in the event of a fire or an emergency, it's you grab the kids, you grab the pets, you grab the photos in that order. And I still remember that. Right now, it is you grab the kids, you grab the loved ones, you grab the animals, and it seems like number 3 would be grab your phone. And Go Kit should be in there too. Yeah. But to Councilor DeCane's earlier point about the paper, it's like I'm really interested in the communications logistics of how we communicate in an emergency relative to people and where they go for information. And so I'm still interested in seeing from how we leverage tech, whether it be in like an app or something where you can go and you can have that information downloaded in paper form or something where we grab and it's here, and that's our communications infrastructure is set for the most part to be able to have a PIO or an incident command push so that you're just waiting. The mayor and I had a discussion with this a while ago about where do I go for information, and just tell me something. How does city leadership communicate to citizens as opposed to waiting for an Everbridge text to come in, as opposed, is there something that's in the works that way, or am I spoiling the ending, or am I dumping something in the suggestion box that's not there yet?
Yes, all of that is in the works. For me, again, I've got to beat the drum of personal preparedness on this because if if you feel like you should go, you shouldn't just be waiting for an Everbridge message, right? Or did I miss
Completely
that?
understand.
Yeah.
But when you are in the midst of going, it is a way that we can, that city leadership and emergency leadership can
Yeah.
communicate in the process of it happening.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to need that. I don't know how to do that for every event. I don't know that anybody does have that. I do know that when we make a decision on like, okay, this is a safe direction to go, let's tell everybody to go that way, it'll be agreed upon from administration as well as electeds. And that might take longer to get that piece of information out. So, yeah, I don't know that I have an exact answer for you, but I do know, for big events, sometimes it can take up to 72 hours before we have a scope and a scale of what's actually going on to get good information out to people. I'm trying to shorten that.
Perfect.
So if I could just, for 1 second, I think from learning from lessons learned from Alameda that regular check-ins with messages going out, even if there is no update, the next update will be a certain time, is better than just radio silence. So our plan would be to have regular updates where people know when those updates will be, even if there is nothing to share. Because I think that is what everyone is going to be waiting for. And as Kelly mentioned, that update, we are lucky enough to have a PIO now, and Kelly, the city manager, administration office, that will be where that message is coming from, so that is a uniform message and accurate information coming from a centralized place. So that is one lesson I think that was learned, that radio silence is, not only discomforting, but can be dangerous. And so that is one thing we are prepared to do. But to Kelly's point, not knowing what the emergency will be, there has to be flexibility in how that gets out. And so we are, aware that Nixle may not work, that perhaps it's police officers with bullhorns going around. It just kind of depends on what's happening. But I think that was a very important lesson learned from a prior event.
If you think about the times that we've had wildfires that are close by too, and if a state team comes in or a CAL FIRE team comes in, they put up signboards in like certain public areas where you can reliably go to every day to get updates. We can do a similar thing. If we have a big event here, it's likely going to affect the region. But having reliable places like your fire station, that's where your public posting could be. If you're, if the satellites, if the fiber goes down, your cell phones go down, at least a place where people can go to each day to get updates. City Hall would be another place as well. But we can identify those places and we can put those up. And I think of worst case scenarios like that all the time.
Councillor Hanson.
Thank you, and thank you for all this information, Kelly. Curious, you gave us some prep at our retreat on FEMA preparedness for electeds, but are there any upcoming trainings that we could take advantage of? I too am a proponent of trainings and being more prepared. So do you know of anything on the horizon?
I don't have any off the top of my head. I know that there are some ongoing. There's one for Public Works that's coming up in Medford here fairly soon, but I can get you some. I'm being pretty noisy down here in Southern Oregon, and hopefully the folks in Salem continue to like to listen to me. So there are more offerings coming out.
Great, thank you. And then for the broader community, as our messaging increases as we get closer to wildfire season, is there anything on the horizon for the community to think about that we could point them like one direct thing, like, well, come to this event? I know you listed some different ones there, but what do you think we should pass on to us?
In fact, just more aggregate of preparedness stuff. Next Tuesday on the 14th, we're doing a test of the Everbridge system. So anybody that's already signed up will be getting a test message, which they can then verify. I'm doing it for the city of Ashland. Jackson County's doing it for the greater Jackson County. So for those of you signed up in both areas, you might get 2 messages. Don't worry about that. More is actually better.
Okay, thank you.
And so I have a follow-up question. It's come up about what happens if we don't have internet access. And, radios do still work. and we can still get them in our vehicles and that kind of thing. I'm wondering if, to Councilor Duquesne's point about something that, could we send something to people that just says, put this on your fridge, right? And then, because we tend to forget, I'm not going to remember the order in which I'm supposed to do things in terms of getting communications. But if it's on the fridge and I go there and I've got my evacuation map and it tells me where I am, but it also says, if the internet is down, go to this radio station, that kind of thing. Is there something like that could, because that's my worst case scenario, is that we're ready to push all this evacuation information and everybody's looking at a phone that doesn't work. Right. So what do we do in that place where things have started to break down to that space?
So we do still run the 1700 AM, which is the fire department does control that radio frequency. And we will be putting out messages on that as well. So the PIO will be updating that through the process. So the AM radio will be available for the community of Ashland, even if our cell phones go down.
So my children don't know what an AM radio is.
Yeah, most people don't.
In fact.
I fear I have not done my job.
I'm not sure if I can buy an FCC license yet for FM radio, so we'll see.
So that's I expected that we could still access that radio channel, but how do we remind people in a moment when maybe they're not going to be right on top of thinking logically, that there is somewhere to go to get information, even if their handheld phone does not work? Just something to think about as we think about what we might send out to people to have in hard copy or to have in some way, in an electronic format that doesn't rely on the internet.
No, I hear you.
And I think still in some of the evacuation zones, it still says 1700 AM for emergency notification. If I remember correctly, I haven't been up to look at the signs lately, but I don't think any of those have been taken down.
Not the old wildfire evacuation zone sign, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
And who has an AM radio anymore?
I think
Somebody does.
In our cars, we all have
cars,
them.
we have it in our
Yeah,
car,
we
right?
all have them in our cars, right? But I think I've talked to a number of people after the Alameda fire who said, I ran out, I grabbed the dirty, I grabbed a pile of socks and I left, grandma's ashes. We're not thinking well when we are trying to figure out how do I keep myself and my family safe? And so how can we as a city prepare for that moment when people need really clear, simple instructions?
Well, here's what you do. So there's home evacuation drills that the emergency manager has been creating. And the first one, which I called level 1, which I didn't have a better name at the time, is like, if you're working in the fire department, you have an operational plan. And it's a 1-page thing that helps you practice what you need to do. And so the level 1 is from the moment of being notified that you need to evacuate, how long does it take you to gather your things, your go kit, your pets, your meds, things like that, load up your mode of conveyance, whether that be a car or your electric bike or whatever else you have. That can get you from one place to the next. How long does it take you from receiving the message to putting everything in there? And then if you have a car, starting your car. Time ends. Then you yourself can look at your time and go, wow, I bet I could shave off a few minutes with some practice. My level 2 is once you've started your car, how long does it take you to drive your normal route of travel out of the city? Start your timer and drive your normal route of the travel out of the city. And because I'm a firefighter, then I had a mean mentor when I was green behind the ears, and he would put me in a room at some point and he said, hey, your way in and out just got blocked, find the second way. And so for me, I want people to practice their normal route, and then I want them to try another one. What happens when that gets blocked? Some of that's on you guys. But that will help you, that'll help you learn your streets. It'll also help you learn your area for where, if all the roads are blocked, where's the biggest open space that you can get to temporarily ride out a storm. I can't tell you exactly where those areas are, but you can learn those. And one of these days, maybe we could identify those places, but that'll be in the works, 3 to 5 year plan. The level 3 then is actually doing a mass evacuation potentially of a zone or a homeowners association, a neighborhood. And back in 2015 or 16, before the Alameda event, before we all got really serious about this. I know that the city tried to put one on, and Chris Chambers was involved in that, and they didn't get much bounce out of it. They didn't get much participation either. I think if we did this next year in March or April, and I mean, I'd love to do it this year, I don't have capacity for it. But if we planned on doing it next year, I think we get a lot of participation in that. So that's my level 3. That's another heavy lift that we're going to try and do. And in the meantime, everyone can do level 1 and 2. What else? Public outreach and education. I've been talking to lots of different groups. I'm going to be talking to the Senior Services Advisory Committee this month. And what else we got? We did the luncheon with the Chamber of Commerce and those businesses, and I gave them an exercise and got them all excited about a wildfire and how are they going to notify their employees. It was good. And, you know, then in the next few weeks, you're just going to see more public outreach, because every municipality and the county, as well as locally here, we're doing a lot of wildfire education, and I'm going to want people to be practicing now, because now's a good time, because as the mayor said, when the event actually happens, sometimes your brain goes out the window and you grab the socks rather than grandma's ashes. So, but if you practice, then you will have something you can fall back on when the event comes.
Great. Any, I believe this is your last slide, is that right, Kelly?
Yep.
Any additional questions? Okay, great. We have someone who has signed up to speak, so if staff, if you can take a seat, we'll have the person come up and speak, and then we'll open it up for any final questions. And we have Paul Mozina, who has signed up to speak to us this evening. Paul, will 3 minutes work for you? Yes. Great.
Push the button.
There it is.
Okay.
Now it is.
My name is Paul Molzina, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. And I sent you all an email about the 23rd or so. This is the email I sent. It had a picture of the sky in Ashland on the morning of April 22nd. That was forecast to be a sunny day, a beautiful sunny day. And by I don't know if my water bottle spilled on it, but I don't know if you remember that day. It was after a period of really nice weather. It was a beautiful day, and it was supposed to be a sunny day. And when I got up and was working at the Jackson Well Springs, I looked up in the sky, and I was shocked to see this much spray up in the sky. And you know, the week before that, it had been the same kind of weather. We had sunny weather. There was nothing unusual about that day, the weather that day. And the reason I'm bringing it to your attention is that there's climate change engineering is going on. This is not a conspiracy theory. Climate change engineering is real. They spray particulate matter into the sky to reflect the sunlight and dim the sun and cool things down. This is what they're doing. This is not a secret. They're doing it all over the world. They spray aluminum, barium, strontium, and other chemicals into the upper atmosphere, and who knows where they land? Who knows where all this landed? But by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, it was a really hazy, overcast day, and it was forecast to be sunny. And this doesn't happen every day. I'm out every day, working in the garden, working outside. I notice when the sky changes like this, and like I said, the days around this particular day were clear. This is not a normal event to have this level. And the reason it's relevant today is that this particulate matter that they spray into the skies it's an accelerant. It's a fire accelerant. When it lands on plants, it desiccates them. It causes plants to die, trees to die. It's contributing to the deaths of the conifers, the Doug firs in our watershed. And as a fire department, I would want to know if there was accelerant residue on the plants or trees that I was going to send my crew out to, or if I wanted to be aware of the behavior of the fire, I would want to know, is there residue from this chemical spraying on the trees and plants that my team is going to be out in? What expectations can I have for the behavior of the fire? So I'm asking you, or asking the chief, to be aware that Geoengineering is real. Climate change engineering is real. It happens all over the world. There's chemicals landing on trees and plants everywhere. This is not a conspiracy theory, and we need to be aware of it, and the fire department should be aware of the status of these soils and the vegetative matter in this neighborhood to see if they should do a different approach for fire mitigation. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. So do we have any additional questions for staff? Great. Before we move on to the next topic, and I know we're pushing late, but these are both really important topics this evening. I wanted to say, having been here during the Alameda fire, our people performed so incredibly well across all of our divisions, putting themselves at very real risk to save other people in what was the perfect storm of an out-of-control wildfire that became an urban wildfire and has had an impact on everyone's psyche here in the entire valley. And what we've seen since is a really honest assessment of what went really well and what needed to be improved on. And what we saw tonight is what comes from the willingness to look at something like that and ask those very important questions. Coming into this fire season, we are so much better prepared than we were before. We still have an incredibly high caliber of staff people who will respond if they're called on to do so. But as a citizen, I know I feel so much better prepared that I have more information about what I can do. And what I would just say to all of us is that we have a responsibility to match the work that our city staff are doing, our firefighters are doing, our police officers are doing, our public works and our administration folks. We have that responsibility around our own homes and properties to do the work, to clean it up, to do what we need to do so that we are reducing our risk, and to do the evacuation preparation work so that in the event of one of these things, we can take care of ourselves and our family, and we can let our firefighters and our police officers and public works folks focus on the people who can't get out of their houses on their own. And so, so glad to have this conversation coming to us ahead of fire season, and thank you all so much for your good work. And we will call Scott up now, and he'll talk to us about the water treatment facility.
So good evening, Council, Mayor. I'm Scott Fleury, Public Works Director for the city, and I have a slide deck to get through. That's going to take some time potentially, and there's some questions. I know Council has some questions, the community has some questions about the project. In my slide deck, I'll try to cover things, and we'll see how far we get. Please interrupt me at any point if you have a question or want a clarification on something I'm going to talk about as part of this. So tonight, generally, overall, I'd like to talk about project development.
Scott, your microphone's not on.
How we get projects developed and initiated for enterprise systems, how projects are estimated and the costing is developed, a status update of the water treatment plant project itself. We'll talk about some construction impacts of the project proposed and what those look like for the community. Why are we building a water treatment plant or propose to build a water treatment plant? Talk about the Medford Water Commission tap intertie. Some questions have come up about that and the capacity of the tap system. Talk about project funding for the water treatment plant specifically and the options that we generally look at for financing infrastructure-related projects. And then also talk about the water rates, cost of service study, and the low-income utility assistance program that we talked about in December of last year as well. So there's a lot of bites at the apple to talk about tonight to get through this, and I'll go fairly fast on a couple things. As part of project development, we call it the cradle to grave process, and it starts with initiating a master plan. for the system. So specifically, we'll talk about water, developing a water master plan. These usually take anywhere from 1 to 2 years to get through, depending on the scope of the plan itself. We've had citizen-appointed committees participate in these projects. Specifically, the Ashland Water Advisory Committee has been part of the last 2 water master plans in 2012 and 2020. Before that, in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was called the Water Advisory Group that was participatory in those processes. All of those meetings that we have with AWAC or other citizen groups are all public meetings where consultants and staff present and discuss the master planning process and the outcomes and projects and level of service goals all get wrapped up into that plan development. Then there's an iterative process with council where we provide council with some information throughout the plan development. So there's a feedback loop with council, and then council is asked to adopt that plan as the guiding document for that enterprise system. Now, once we get to that stage, things get put in the budget. They get put in the capital plan. They get run through the budget process. They get approved by the council that way. Then we have appropriations to begin the project and the project initiation. Our typical operating protocol for project initiation is to develop a request for proposal, go through the preliminary engineering phase, the final engineering phase, construction administration, and the actual construction phase for the project. Now, let's see if we can do this. Now, these steps right here are really out there generally what I would say in the public and public participation, public meetings and things like that. When we get over here to these phases for the engineering, those are kind of things that happen behind the scenes. Those are things that staff handle on the day-to-day as their day-to-day business with the consultants and our staff team. You know, for the water treatment plant project or other water projects, we also involve the water treatment team. The distribution team is part of that, you know, iterative feedback loop when we go through the design process. Same thing with wastewater. We'll invite them to be part of that team as part of that engineering development moving forward, because we can design a lot of things and put a lot of things on the ground, but the operators and the utility workers have to maintain that. And so understanding what they're getting into, what they need to do to maintain these systems throughout their life is an important aspect of how we kind of manage this process, you know, from start to finish. Now, as part of that, we also develop costs, and cost varies pretty dramatically depending on what you know about a project. The master plan gives you an initial cost. Then when we go through the engineering phase, you know, we have a 30% cost, a 60% cost, a 90% cost, and a 100% cost. Each one of those iterations improves the accuracy. So typically our first cost is at the master plan, and you can see the variability, you know, low expected actual versus high expected actual, you know, has a 150% swing from top to bottom. Until you get down to the class 1, which is where we're currently at with the water treatment plant project, you know, you have variability of about 10 to 15% top or bottom, and what we're calling now the opinion of cost, not the cost estimate. So you can see when we first put these in the budget, they are associated with a master plan as part of that. Then as we go through, those CIP numbers get refined as we get more information. So when you see an initial number, it is not going to be technically the last number you'll see as part of that project development over time. And some of these projects take years to get through this process. So, you know, we are unfortunate in the fact that we have to put that number in the budget to begin with, and knowing that that's not the right number at that time when you put it in there as part of the master plan process. It gets refined until we get to what we perceive to be an accurate number. Now, they can be impacted by inflation, you know, the construction industry and other issues that come up, but we do our best to work through this process and iteratively refine these cost estimates moving forward to bring that the best information we can at that time to the council. Now, for the water treatment plant, we're currently at 100% design with plans, specs, and estimates for the project. Now, I'm going to talk about the multi-barrier approach and what that means over the next couple slides. But the new treatment plant will have a multi-barrier treatment approach process to it that will kind of, as best we can, future-proof what we need for treatment of potable water for the community. We have planning approval, conditional use permit approval for site development through the planning department already. And as you know, we've received, a preliminary notification of award of up to $75 million from the Environmental Protection Agency using their WIFIA program as part of funding the total project. That total amount is pending some potential reductions in grant applications that we have out through the state revolving fund loan process right now. So that number could change, but that is our maximum target number right now as part of the overall project.
Councilor Bloom.
Thank you. Yeah, just since you're on that right now. So to be clear for everybody, in the community, that we're not going to have delivery of $75 million in a bank account and go do something. This is going to be done in installments, right? So we're taking a chunk of money, we're going to begin, and then as we need more, we kind of will draw from that. Is that correct?
Yeah, generally, I was going to cover that on a financial
Sorry.
slide deck in a little bit to go over the options for funding these projects, but you are correct. And I can cover that in a little more detail in a minute. And as you can see, the cost estimate up there on the slide is the 100% cost estimate. So, our range is $71 million to $55 million, with the 0% target being the $61 million for the project overall. Plus the additional alternatives that we've added in there, which is the solar array and the battery storage system. As part of the construction phase, those don't have to be built, but they are intuitively allowed to be constructed at any time as part of the project. So if they want to be added in the future, we can do that. The systems are in place with the general facility design and electrical component layout, and the telemetry are all there to accept that addition in the future if the council chooses not to move forward with those right now as part of the construction phase of the project. Now, when I talk about the multi-barrier approach, this is our current generally schematic of the water treatment plant and what the process is. And it's a direct filtration process. And by direct filtration, what I mean is raw water comes into the treatment plant, chemicals are added, and the water runs through a flocculation basin and develops what we call a flock, where it binds the organic materials together. Then that water is then moved through carbon anthracite filters, where the filters, sand and carbon, catch the flock and the organic material. Then that water is sent to a disinfection clear well where it's added, chlorine is added to it, and then it's sent to the distribution system as potable water for the community. Occasionally, the filters are what we call backwashed, where they will clean the filters and that organic material off of them, and that material is wasted then to the sewer. And it's sent to the sewer treatment plant where it's treated at the sewer plant and then released to Bear Creek as part of the sewer process. Now, when we talk about the multi-barrier approach, what we're looking at doing for the new treatment plant is two additional steps. One is pre-treatment with ozone as a hardy disinfection to essentially kill any algal toxins in the water. Then we go to the same process where we have chemical addition and you develop that flock. And then the new addition for the new treatment plant would be sedimentation, which is where you remove any sort of turbidity or sediment that's in the water as part of a new step. And then same thing, that water is filtered, it's disinfected and sent to town as potable water. One of the reasons we're looking at sedimentation and ozone for the new treatment plant is because we do have a reservoir that's has and will continue to have algal blooms in it as part of our water system. We also do have fluctuations in turbidity in the water based on the rain events. For example, last January, December, when we had that pretty significant rainfall come through, the turbidity in the reservoir spiked pretty dramatically. You know, we're less than 1 NTU generally, and it spiked to 15 to 20 NTU. Our treatment plant operators had to shut down the plant for half a day in order to get their process aligned for chemical treatment to bring that turbidity within to appropriate limits for the Oregon Health Authority requirements. So the sedimentation step addition allows us to manage that variability that we see in the reservoir from turbidity spikes, which we have an expectation that that will only continue to grow based on the climate change impacts, because we'll be seeing heavier and more rain in spring and less snowpack. And on granitic surfaces, we expect more runoff to bring that sediment load into the reservoir, and it's something, you know, we expect to have to manage in the future. We also expect the same impacts to impact the algal issue in the reservoir, because we're going to look at warmer springs, warmer summers, extended period of warm time before, as Chief Sartain said, we're waiting for the October rainfall. You know, so there's an extended period on the shoulder seasons where we're going to have warm issues, which will exacerbate the algal toxin problem in the reservoir. You know, currently we have a couple management techniques that we do. We have an aquatic scientist who helps us test the algal toxins in the reservoir when the columns start to build, and then he helps recommend a treatment approach. You know, sometimes we do treat the reservoir. It's a green clean mixture which we add, which is essentially hydrogen peroxide to the reservoir to help manage it. One of the issues is there's a balance technique with that, is if you kill the algal toxin, you actually open it up and release the toxin into the water supply, whereas if you don't kill it, you keep it whole and together as part of its process. And then the expectation is to, you know, catch what we can on the filter as part of that process, whereas ozone would completely destroy it in the water supply as part of that pretreatment process and remove it overall. So those are our kind of future-proof items. Now, you hear a lot in the news recently about PFOAs, the forever chemical. Now, we don't have anything in the process to deal with PFOAs, and one of the reasons we don't is because it's a surface water source that's fed by snowpack. It is not, the city's water source is not a groundwater source that's influenced by surface water. So you see the PFOA issue in other locations where you have groundwater that's influenced by surface water, that's influenced by, you know, industrial use or dumps or things like that, where the chemical can leach into the groundwater system. So the community is really fortunate to have a pristine water source that's protected in the watershed that doesn't allow the influence of other sources on it. So that's one of the reasons that, you know, we're not worried about PFOAs as part of the treatment process that we've developed for the new plant.
So Scott, I think we have a couple of questions. Councillor Hyatt?
Scott, thank you. I know this is a lot to move through. With the sedimentation and the incident where the sedimentation resulted in the closure of the plant for half a day, how was that handled in a way such that the citizens never had to boil water, the citizens never were aware the plant was shut down, and that we continue to receive potable water without knowing of the challenges our staff admirably dealt with?
So what we have is storage, potable water storage in our tank system. You know, we have just under 7 million gallons of stored water in the tanks at any given time throughout the community. In wintertime, you know, your demand is 1.5 to 1.9 million gallons a day. So within that storage, we have built in for the demand, we have built in for fire nested storage. So there's capacity for fire in the zones where that storage is, and also emergency storage is part of that system. So we have that in place. So that allows us to, you know, take the plant offline for hours at a time, and for the operators, for them to align their treatment process for the changing water conditions. Now, that changes slightly when you get into summertime demand because you're at 5.5 to 6 million gallons a day. So we don't like the concept of thinking about shutting down the treatment plant because that will get into that treated water storage a lot faster at that point. So those are things that we try to refrain from doing operationally. If we had to, as part of this, there's options to go and operate off the East and West Forks if we have an algal bloom, but again, the flow in the East and West Forks that we could pipe and divert to the treatment plant is significantly less than what the stored water in the reservoir would provide us, especially later in summer as part of that. So with the new ability of the plant to handle sedimentation, it can handle those big arcs. We wouldn't have to shut down the plant to do any changes to it operationally. And we've also discussed this because we don't always need a sedimentation step as part of our treatment process. So we can run without it if we need to, and save that process time and the, maintenance activities that are required of that step.
Quick follow-up.
Councillor Hyatt.
So Scott, understanding that way of navigating turbidity events, I didn't hear you say tap. Is that because we can't leverage the tap system in the southeast part of town?
So, we could use tap to augment that flow that we would lose during that time. But tap, as a reminder, only serves one half of the city right now. It's currently divided by Ashland Creek. So the remainder of the city, in what we call the Croson Zone, which is to the south and east of Ashland Creek, would be running on the Alsing Reservoir and the Croson Reservoir during that time that we had a shutdown as part of that. So there is that dynamic. And then tap, I will say the fastest we can probably turn around starting it is about a day. Because we would have to coordinate with Medford Water Commission and Duff. They would have to ramp up their production. We also have to let Talent in Phoenix know because they have to make changes to their pump stations and the regional pump station to provide for that additional flow. So, on our side, it's usually about a day. So if we have a short incident like that, we couldn't get it going quick enough, to provide that buffer during that time frame.
Thank you, Scott.
Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mayor. So Scott, I'm going to back you up a little bit here, and maybe just so I can figure out how to explain this to our citizens without sneaking in the word, colloidal or flocculation in here. But what I'm hearing you say, and please interrupt me at any time, is that the existing water treatment plant, which they've known these issues have been coming since they were studied, you put it in the packet of 1991. There are certain conditions for which the current water treatment plant cannot handle, potentially cannot handle. So far, so good?
It has limitations, correct?
It has limitations to it, right? And we have to be able to handle those conditions. And one of the ways that we do that is by shutting the plant down and using stored water while we're doing that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, and those conditions are happening more and more frequently, correct?
We expect them to continue to happen more frequently. We expect more and larger algal blooms in the reservoir because of climate change, and we expect, runoff conditions to change based on storm conditions in spring and summer that are proposed, in our climate change analysis.
And just to cut to the very scary punchline it is projected that these types of conditions are going to happen with such frequency, may happen with such frequency and magnitude that the existing water plant with its existing limitations will not be able to handle the municipal water supply as well as running out of current storage.
Correct.
Okay. So far, so good. Thank you.
Councillor Hanson.
Thank you, and thank you for all this, Scott. Many of us didn't know that we had an algae bloom issue until we knew about it, and I didn't know about it until I joined council. But our current plant can't handle treating the algae bloom, correct?
So it's handled it for the time that we've been doing treatment. Our expectation is the blooms are only going to get worse and bigger. And that's where I reference, we have to be careful about treating the bloom in the reservoir itself through our current measures, because we don't want to open up the algae and release the toxin and not be able to filter it out, which is a potential that could happen. And that's where you get in, you're past a boil water notice if you have a toxic hit and your sample in the treated water. You are at a do not drink advisory for the community itself. So it's not a boil, it's a do not drink. The Oregon Health Authority has specific requirements for algal testing in your raw water and treated water. And if it samples and you have it in the raw and then you have it in the treated, you have to sample again. And if you have it, then you have to notify the community. In 2020, when we were running TID, right before the Alameda fire, we actually had a positive hit for algal toxin in the TID water. And so we immediately shut that off, knowing that we want to be conservative and protect our ability to treat the water. And so we know that issue is going to come up in the reservoir itself. And TID, if we use TID in the future as a supplemental source, we want the ability to, basically kill off any algal toxins that we pump to the plant in that supplemental source.
So the new plant has an added ozone feature that will be able to take care of the algae toxins. And we don't need to talk about what our game plan would be to treat the reservoir should it get really bad. That's a whole nother topic. But rest assured that this plant has the technology to deal with future-proofing this threat.
Correct. And ozone is a commonly used system to treat these. Medford Water Commission has ozone. Grants Pass and their new treatment plant will have ozone. Most other new treatment plants that are being built or modified are adding ozone when you have these water quality concerns in your source water supply.
Great, thank you.
Scott, my question follows on behind this. So we would, because this is related to warmer temperatures and warmer water, is it accurate to say that we would expect to have problems with toxic algal blooms in the time of the summer when we are likely to be using the most water every day?
Correct.
Right. So
Yeah.
so when we're watering our yards and we're trying to keep our gardens going and we're drawing the largest amount of water that we're likely to draw, that's when we would potentially get the do not drink, do not use this water signal.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councilor Hyatt.
Just to follow on to that, Scott, what would it take for ozone to be in the current plant?
So I have a schematic. I didn't put it in my slide deck. As most of you know, well, here, let's look at this. So here's an aerial shot of the current plant. Those blue arrows are Ashland Creek. The red arrows go up a very significant steep embankment. Now, part of the treatment plant boundary is actually the embankment of Ashland Creek. If you've ever seen it, the brick of the basins, help form the creek bank. Now, we did look at how could we potentially rehabilitate the existing plant and add ozone pre-treatment. And the only way that HDR could figure out how to do it when we were having these conversations was basically remove this hillside and create that space for the piping and the equipment necessary to generate ozone and have a pre-treatment facility up there. When you have ozone, you have to have a certain contact time with the raw water in it. And so the new plant, we have a length of pipe that's been sized to allow for that appropriate contact time for that disinfection process. And then it's quenched, and the ozone is quenched from the water, and then it's sent to the rest of the processes. So in order to do that and create the correct size piping and the infrastructure, that whole hillside would need to be removed. And I believe they estimated that at about $15 million just to do that improvement. Now, I will say, part of the overall issue when we talked about the ozone and rehabilitating the existing plant is you see this in the Black and Veatch report that was in your packet, and it's been discussed before, is that when you start doing heavy construction around an old facility, there's risk of damaging that old facility and actually creating problems with it. You have old concrete basins that are unreinforced. So you have the vibration and the heavy equipment moving there. You could actually damage that facility and then be in a worse position because you're having to look at repairing it. Plus, you're operating that plant 24/7 during that construction window if you're to rehabilitate. So there's just overall risk, and the risk itself for a contractor doing something like this is going to drive up the project cost as well.
Can I have a follow-up? So, Scott, what you're saying is to add the ozone to this plant, we have to do demolition on the side of a mountain, which creates a seismic event that this plant can't handle.
There's concern from the engineering review that we could damage the facility and its structural integrity, and then we would have a double whammy of figuring out on the fly how to resolve any damage we created to the existing facility.
So we create the seismic event this plant can't handle.
Yeah, correct.
Thank you.
Councilor Bloom?
Thanks. To that point, I was just going to add too that I would imagine that digging up a sizable chunk of the mountain would also increase the risk of mass wasting, which could also cause additional damage. Is that?
Yeah, well, and you're looking at having to, remove that material and haul it off and dispose of it in a location. So you have a significant haul distance to take all of that and dispose of it. And just as a reminder, one of the cost impacts for the new treatment plant is removal of the spoiled fill that's been put in the granite pit site for numerous years. So that is already an impact that we're having to deal with by having short haul distances for parks and public works to dispose of materials is now coming back to pinch us, as that material now has to be removed from that site and relocated to another location that accepts that material at a significant cost.
Thank you.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. Scott, thanks for all the information. I wish that this information had have been out sooner because people have so many questions regarding this. One of the questions, we were talking about construction, looking at building the new water treatment plant, how is that going to hit the greenhouse gases and our SEEP goals that we want to reach by 2030?
That's a loaded question. So one of the things we talked about is trying to minimize our environmental impact. There is a embedded carbon in building a new structure like this. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. What we tried to do as part of the overarching process is mitigate where we could and we thought feasible. One of the things was the alternative power generation on site, which reduces the power consumption needs of the treatment plant. As a reminder, when HDR did that analysis, we were looking at about 170 days of net operating time based on 199 kilowatt solar array system on there. So you'd get 180 days of net power generation to operate the facility. The new facility is more efficient generally than the existing facility. It's going to use less chemicals as part of its process. It's just more efficient. So there's things we looked at like that. Storm drainage, improving the storm drainage and low impact development treatment for the system to outfall that into the creek. Minimizing the footprint of the facility itself. Getting it as tight as we could so we're not, in a big campus-like area for the water treatment plant was another thing we looked at doing to, minimize our carbon impact for construction of the new plant.
That's once it's done, then things can be minimized. But in the process of doing it, it will elevate our greenhouse gases.
And the same would be true of rehabilitating the existing plant. You still
Well,
have that same
yeah, but-
impact.
So something that I was thinking about, you brought up the use of the electrification of the new plant. Where it's going to be located, we're not going to have the type of gravity pull that we have here. So is it going to take more electricity to keep that going, or what is that going to look like? Can our grid handle a new water treatment plant as we move forward to electrify Ashland, building new buildings?
So we're set up from the energy consumption standpoint to operate with the existing grid and network that we have as part of our infrastructure. You know, I know Tom is going through the electric master plan process and looking at that expansion, you know, for additional load and burden. But we will be taking one treatment plant offline and replacing it with one treatment plant that is generally more efficient. So I don't expect, you know, that load to overburden what we already have in the electrical infrastructure structure.
Makes sense. What's going to happen to the old water treatment plant?
So the first thing that will happen as part of that process is all the chemical equipment will be removed. We still want to keep the facility generally as it is, but all the chemical and electronic equipment can be removed because we won't need to operate out of that plant. The power plant will still be operational and be utilized as part of that. You know, and our operators kind of still need a place to go during the day. So every day, you know, they operate out of the current plant, but they have to go to the dam. They do a visual on the dam. They do a visual on the east and west forks. So they could have an area to go to write up reports. You know, we can use that facility for meetings with consultants and other people. You know, when we do our dam inspection, you know, that's a good stop to meet and have a sit down. They have to inspect the power plant. So, you know, basically keeping the facility generally there, but removing the guts of it would be our first step.
Scott, I recall when we first started to work with this, that we were looking at the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure's Envision program with a specific focus on energy efficient building and then also energy efficient and renewable energy power. Are we still on track in terms of that program?
Yeah, I think based on our design and the layout for the credit structure, we were looking at the gold status for the Envision program. You know, one of the things we added in part of the iterative design process is kind of skylights in the facility to let in more natural light, so you wouldn't need more artificial light for the facility. The storm drain improvements were part of that Envision program. The kind of the overarching life cycle replacement program and plan will be part of that to all increase your scoring along with the solar alternate power generation process associated with the Envision kind of goal of hitting gold.
Great, thank you. Any other questions so that we can and then we'll let Scott move on. Councilor Dale.
Just one quick question. Thank you, Mayor. So just to put a period on the previous point is one of the things when we're going through all this information, which is wonderful, sometimes I think we kind of blow past the fact that you have indeed considered all other alternatives. And with the algal blooms and so forth was you considered alternatives and discarded those in favor of this particular project, correct? That's question one.
Yeah, so, you know, we started this whole process off with an alternative site analysis. So we looked at 5 sites, and then through that iterative process, we developed that this would be the best site, given its conditions and ability, city-owned property, all of that. After that, we went through kind of a piloting program. What's our best treatment process for treating our water quality and our conditions? And that's where we got to the conventional filtration process with the ozone. We actually did a pilot test with membranes. Other locations use membranes as part of their filtration process. So we've worked through that iteratively to get to what we believe is the best outcome for the new plant.
Perfect. And yeah, I just wanted to point out that that's buried in a lot of the technical data sometimes that work has been done. Secondly, while you got the slide up here, in addition to, we're getting an aerial shot of it's worked well for 3/4 of a century and it's not in the best location and so forth. In addition to the ozone, is there anything while we're looking at this slide that this particular facility is incapable of doing at this location in addition to carving out the side of a mountain to put ozone in?
So the sedimentation step, we couldn't add it. There's no room. It actually had sedimentation, and that was removed in the 90s. What they did is they improved the chemical building for chemical additions. This area was the sedimentation basin, and then it went into flocculation. So it was chemical addition. Now it's chemical and flocculation, and then the filtration is over here. So we couldn't add that part of a pre-treatment step.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so just kind of a high-level overview of the construction impacts. We're looking at about a 30-month window for construction, 3 to 6 months of commissioning and startup for the plant in order to get Oregon Health Authority approval to actually bring the plant online and start serving the community potable water with the new structure. As a reminder, the preferred alternative location where everything's been designed is what we call the Granite Pit site, which is directly to the west of the swimming hole that everyone knows, and then just above what we call the Granite Reservoir, which is the big concrete reservoir in Ashland Creek near the swimming hole. Now, probably the main impact is going to be trucks and traffic on Granite Street. You're going to have fill removal, you're going to have construction equipment, you're going to have contractors, you're going to have delivery drivers delivering things up to that site. There will be ebbs and flows of traffic in the area along Granite Street. Another mild but significant impact is Granite Street at the culvert crossing where Ashland Street goes underneath, or Ashland Creek goes underneath the road. We're replacing that culvert, which is right there. And the road itself will need to be closed for a couple months while we go through that process where all the off-site pipeline work is done and then the culvert is replaced as part of that. There will be parking impacts, removal of parking for a significant amount of time to the west of that culvert crossing as well, where people park to go to the ferry ponds. One of the things that we worked pretty hard on throughout this process is still to maintain trail access. We worked with the Trails Association, specifically Torsten, for a long time in development of the Wonder Trail and trying to work through that process with them to ensure that it kind of stayed outside of the water treatment plant boundary. So we went through that process. We expect to have temporary access for the trails during the construction portion of it, so people will still have access to where they want to go through a temporary connection. We want to make sure that it's safe for the public using the area and safe for the contractors as part of that, so there'll be some notification and warning about what's going on up there as part of that process. And then once we get through the offsite work, the bulk of the work will actually happen on the parcel, kind of away from the general view other than the Wonder Trail on the backside for the remainder of the construction period. So that's where they're going to do the excavation, the foundation, construct the facilities, do all the underground work and everything. So a bulk of the work will happen on the site for a majority of the project scheduled window. We also have to get a contractor on board because they're the ones who are going to develop that overall schedule of activities when they want to do things. One of the things that we're talking about internally, and we're going to talk to the regulators about, is there's an in-water work period window, which is June to September, to do that culvert. Well, that's in the watershed and during fire season. And the reason you have that in-water work period is you want to minimize your impact to fish migration, spawning, and habitat. Well, there's no fish spawning, migration, or habitat above the swimming hole dam. You know, that's a known barrier. So we want to have conversations with the regulators about starting a little bit earlier in that window with the culvert project, so we don't have the potential impacts moving into later season with the fire season, and access up there to the 2060 road and things like that, of which we've had discussions with the Forest Service and ODF about that as well, and providing access for them for firefighting activities if anything were to occur in the watershed. So there's still some unknowns on what the construction schedule and activities would be, and that would be information that we would push out to the public when we got to that stage, with Nixle, Everbridge, you know, our tools at our disposal as part of that process.
Councillor Kaplan.
Yes, Scott, so how are you going to get the water to the plant?
So we've got this trick up our sleeves. We plan to use the potable water line that brings water to Granite Reservoir and Croson Reservoir, the first line, as the raw water line in the future. So our off-site piping connections will all happen down in the roadway right here. And so currently, potable water comes down right here and then goes down Granite and then loop and up to the reservoir and down Granite. So what we're going to do is tie that over to the off-site pipeline work that takes it to the new treatment plant. And there'll be some piping work that'll have to occur at the existing treatment plant to bypass the treatment plant itself. So it'll go in the road and connect around the treatment plant and then bring raw water down to the new treatment plant. Our trick is figuring out how to commission the plant, knowing that we can't get true raw water there. So we've been working on a plan with HDR, and this will be part of what the consultant has to do, the contractor is develop that commissioning plan of how do we, I'll just say, infect the water with organic, chemical or organics, and then treat it at the new treatment plant in kind of a closed loop system. And so we've kind of set it up to do that, but it'll be up to the contractor to actually put the final process in place to do that closed loop treatment in order for us to certify that the plant does what it's supposed to do and get Oregon Health Authority approval then to actually finalize it and bring it online.
Do you have a follow-up?
Well, it's getting deep into the weeds. I don't think I need to do there.
Okay.
Thanks. But it sounds like it's great, and yeah, it has the capacity. The size of the pipes is sufficient for that.
Correct. Yeah, it's a 24-inch.
Great solution. And with minimum impacts.
So just a reminder, kind of why we headed down this road. This project, you know, had been talked about in the early 90s, as referenced in your packet. It became a formal project in 2012 when it was recommended as part of the Water Master Plan. It was meant to replace the existing plant. Now, back in 2012, it was envisioned to be a smaller plant to meet future peak capacity needs in the summer, and then expanded over time to meet the full need and demand of the community, and then take the existing plant offline completely. In 2017, there was a discussion with the council about looking at operating only one plant, not building a partial plant and expanding it over time, looking at the costs, looking at the risks, and that recommendation was brought forward to the council to not build two plants, operate two plants, bring in an extra operator to do that just to meet projected peak capacity deficiencies. Instead, build a new treatment plant to meet the full demand of the community. And that's when we started down that process after council agreed that that was a better direction to build a new functional treatment plant instead of piecemealing it over time as part of an overall process. The project is also meant to mitigate the risk we know the site has. Flooding, we know it has flooding. It's in the watershed. There's potential fire issues associated with it. The facility is pre-seismic code construction. So we know it will be damaged during an earthquake. And then we know it has limitations for water quality issues that we see in the reservoir and will see.
Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mayor. So Scott, I appreciate that. I don't want to blow past that very important point, though. If you could just linger on it for a little bit. Like, that's a question that the community has, was what was, to the extent you could explain it to non-engineers, what was the aha moment that happened in 2016 where we went from, can you just spend just a little high-level time saying what was that moment where the AWAC had a master plan coming out of 2012? I heard you about, council budget. We've got to iterate through that. It takes a couple, 3 years. And then you have this point in 2016 where the water committees reconvened. There was a moment there where we switched gears. What was that spark that changed our direction there?
So I think it was conversations with new leadership at that time and AWAC. I will say I believe that most of the members of AWAC and part of that process, they felt that it would be better to build the new treatment plant all in one shot, but they expressed the same concerns that many are, is that the cost impact at a one-time shot would be a burden and too much to bear. And so that's where they came up with that philosophy to expand it over time. And back then, it was meant to meet the peak demand, and the peak demand was forecasted to be above the current plant's demand in 2018. So there was a sense of urgency to go, okay, we got to do something. Let's start doing some design work. Because if we're going to hit that peak demand capacity issue in 2018, we don't have a lot of time to get there. Now, 2014 and 15 kind of redirected the community's demand of water for the significant drought years that we had. So we didn't ever realize, that full impact of demand. And so since we knew that was happening, and we also had the tap connection and the intertie in place, that, I guess, allowed us to take a step back and slow down the process and go, okay, what do we think is the best next step, knowing what we know now. And with that discussion with AWAC and Public Works staff, the recommendation came out of that to, move forward with the new treatment plant. You're going to get operational savings. You won't have to hire additional staff to operate the plant. You can, build a new plant, and the new plant will take the same amount of staff the existing plant has and operates under. You'll have the benefit of life cycle savings as part of that. Knowing that the existing plant, it's only going to cost more annually to operate and repair and maintain versus the new plant, where you get that benefit of economy of scale for the first decade or two before you start to see maintenance-related issues and increased costing on the operational side. Similar to what we're experiencing right now with the wastewater treatment plant. You have a 25-year-old upgraded facility. It's starting to see more and more higher-level maintenance-related items that need repair and replacement.
Scott, and correct me if I'm wrong, we need about $15 to $20 million investment in the current plant. So there is not an option of spending no money. There would be a sunk cost of that, and still the need to replace with a new plant.
Yeah, depending on
cost.
what you did as part of rehabilitation, you're $10 to $15 million for all of the big ticket items you would need to do. Plus, if you wanted to do any sort of pre-treatment, I think that cost estimate from a couple years ago was almost $28 million to do all of that work at the existing site, of which you still couldn't mitigate all of the known risks. And in fact, you create risk by doing those modifications.
Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. Bringing up the cost of this, I saw that I believe, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I think it's like $18.6 million in the water fund. And I bring that up because I look at, you touched on the wastewater treatment plant earlier. We had the 5% mills tax in place to pay for the wastewater treatment plant. My question, I guess, would be to this body and our administration is why can't we put it on the ballot and take that 5% mills tax and pay for another water treatment plant instead of this impacting the ratepayer so much?
So that is an option.
I would like to really consider that option because there's, great questions asked, great presentation. Everybody wants clean water, and a municipality runs best when our infrastructure is strong. So why can't we consider taking that 5% and paying off another water treatment plant?
I think it's also important to recognize that there's capital costs, but also water rates have not been raised since 2019, and operational costs have increased since then. So there will be a water rate adjustment, even if there was a food and beverage tax component to paying for infrastructure costs.
Well, I just think this is something that should be considered, and we might want to look at this and looking at the big picture.
So there will be a rate discussion coming up in this conversation. Scott, I have a question. Looking at the timeline of what it takes to build a new water treatment facility, what happens if an earthquake happens and our current water treatment facility that we can't earthquake-proof becomes inoperable? What does that look like? We understand that half of the community could be served by tap, maybe, but what are we looking at? What kind of timeline are we looking at for being able to have our system fully back up and running?
So it varies. We do have access to tap, so depending on the damage to the tap system, we could access that and provide half the community with some level of water service as part of that. Now, damage to the plant and the other half of the community, we do have, and we're working on it right now, to spec out a temporary pump, skid-mounted pump, that will be hooked to a manifold to boost from the granite zone to the tap zone in an emergency. So we're working on that process until we get a permanent pump station put in the system that boosts to the Croson zone, so the whole community can have access to that. Now, that's a very limited supply because we're talking about 2 million gallons a day. So basically, if this were to happen, the community would be on curtailment. I would say stage 5, we're at the bare bones minimum of water. Now, if we don't have the boost in place, what we would look at doing, and I don't have an exact time frame, but we've talked about this internally, is you bring in a temporary trailer treatment plant that runs, a membrane filtration process and treats the water to the minimum acceptable standards, and then that gets put in the distribution system. So that would be our emergency fallback upon everything else, is to have, a membrane filtration plant on a trailer and plumbed into our raw water system, sending water to the community. As a reminder, it's kind of similar to what we did with the wastewater centrifuges. We brought in a trailer-mounted centrifuge as an emergency redundancy backup in case we had a failure of the one that was still operating, and had that in place.
And so with that temporary trailered system, we would still be in level 5 curtailment for quite some time.
Yes, especially considering the potential damage to the existing facility, and being able to bring that back online, and what that would look like operationally. The Oregon Resilience Plan kind of has outlines of when you're designing new infrastructure, how long should it take to bring these systems back online? And the overall design for the new treatment plant kind of takes into account those times. You have a few days before you're able to minimally produce water and send it to the community. You have a few months before, and that's in the backbone of the system. You have a couple months before you make all the repairs that you notice out in the system. So those kind of guidelines were followed as part of our design process.
Okay, great.
And I think the figure was in your packet.
It was.
Yeah. Okay, we can keep going.
So I like showing this, and we talked about it a little bit already, the location. And you see the big red X. So that's the power plant. Now, if you're standing on the road, this is the access road, goes all the way up to the dam. You're standing right here and looking upstream towards the dam. This is what you get. This is standing right there by the filters looking up that road. So that's the embankment. These are pictures of the 74 flood and what it looks like coming down that road. This is one of my favoriteest pictures that I found. This is one of the operators, and he's on an old operator building that's come off the foundation and floated into the embankment just on the other side of this hill as part of that. And so you got to think that there's a person standing on that embankment taking that picture of him while he's lying on the house casually watching the floodwaters go by. So this is one of the biggest factors up at the treatment plant is the flood issue and the damage it can do and the return time it takes to get operational again. There were weeks in '97 where the plant was down, and it wasn't down because the facility itself was tragically damaged, but all the sediment burden hit that whole area and had to be removed, and then the system's restored. So now we have significant electrical components. The plant operates through telemetry, and water in that facility will damage all of that electrical. So the only way to remedy that is you have to run the plant in manual after that point if it's damaged. And by manual, I mean it's staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until it's repaired because the operators need to be there. They need to make adjustments. They need to see what's going on. Whereas the new plant is out of the floodplain. It's out of the canyon. It's out of the prime area of the watershed there in the steep canyon where fire is a concern. It's out of the landslide area that we know is mapped just downstream of the treatment plant overall. So that was one of the things to mitigate the risk. And I always like showing a couple of these pictures to people. I think it's pretty intense of what they've had to go through. So also, there's been a lot of discussion about the tap intertie, Medford Water Commission connection. Why can't we get more water or all of our water from the Water Commission? So currently, the system itself, TAP, is designed to push 2.13 million gallons a day of water into the community, into half. We have an allowance in the existing pump station to add another pump to boost that to 3 million gallons a day. So the city has acquired 1,000 acre feet of stored water in Lost Creek, which is diverted through Duff to the city through the TAP system, which is about 325 million gallons. The city uses about 1 billion gallons of water a year as a kind of an average number. And so Medford has already said that they don't want to give us any more than that 3 million gallons a day of water. They have been designing their infrastructure improvements based on that projected demand. So if we were to move forward, it would have to be a conversation with them to see about their willingness to change trajectory to provide the community with those projected peak capacity needs in the future. As part of that, there's a system development charge discussion that would need to occur. And then, there is a significant amount of planning and engineering work that would have to go into developing a plan to be able to get, let's just say 7 million gallons a day of water from Medford through Phoenix, through Talent, into Ashland's distribution system and to both sides of the city. And I suspect that we're probably looking at a 5-year process to go through the feasibility and the analysis and the cost estimating. And then you're probably looking at another 5 to 7 years of construction in the various communities and coordinating that as part of an overall process in order to, bring a full allotment of TAP. You also need to discuss that with the regulators. So you'd have to purchase more water rights. So that involves Water Resources Department. That involves the Army Corps of Engineers discussion. And there is some general concern about Water Resources wanting to allow you to have more access to water in Lost Creek, knowing that you have significant water rights on Ashland Creek already as part of that. So there's just some concern about the regulatory hurdle we would have to get through just to acquire all of that water right to meet the future demand, let alone the pricing. And so right now, Medford just had a rate increase of 4 cents that went into effect, I believe it was March 1st. So there's a summertime rate for the partner cities and a wintertime rate, and it's only going to increase as we move forward. And you look at the cents per gallon or per thousand, and just to give you an idea, the operational budget for the water fund is about 8.5 million a year. So 1 billion gallons of water production for 8.5 million. So you're looking at 8.5 cents per thousand is what we produce water at right now, just kind of on the operational side. So you see kind of the pricing difference that you have between the commission's pricing and what the city of Ashland provides water to the community for. You also have storage fees for Lost Creek and the Army Corps. You have your miscellaneous fees associated with pumping taps. So there's sewer fees that you need to pay. RVSS, where the tap pump station is, you pay the electrical for Pacific Power to operate the pump station. So there's additional fees that get burdened into that overall tap cost. So that's the primary reason why, we haven't focused in or had much discussion on expanding the tap system to meet the demand of the community moving forward. So funding, the big question. We initiated a process with the EPA to use their WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act funding mechanism. And we've been working on that process since about 2021. Other typical mechanisms that we use to fund projects where you don't have enough cash available to fund the total project are revenue bonds, which is a pledge of the revenue from that enterprise to pay back that debt you secure. We've used the Safe Drinking Water Fund through Business Oregon to fund some projects. They don't have the money to fund a project at this costing level. They work in the $1 to $3 to $6 million range primarily for smaller projects. So you would need an additional funding source to help cover the cost. We've also applied for a couple grants. I've mentioned this before, the bipartisan infrastructure law, emerging contaminants, has funded the State Drinking Water Fund a certain amount to eliminate emerging contaminants from your water system, of which the city is listed on the state's plan for algal toxins as one of our emerging contaminants. A lot of other communities have PFOA contaminant listings as part of that, and so they'll be eligible for some of this grant funding to help mitigate those problems. I'm expecting, based on our recent conversation with the IFA, to hopefully have access, to some of that grant funding in spring of 2025. And we've also had discussions now that we have a natural hazard mitigation plan about looking at FEMA funding, their BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, as another potential grant funding opportunity. And I think that closes in fall of this year. So I've had an initial conversation with Evan Brooks, our grant consultant assistant, about looking at that program. And so I'll have additional conversations with them about going after funding. Grants Pass has been going after BRIC funding. Medford Water Commission also went after BRIC funding too. It's just a very slow, inertial moving program to get to the finish line. But that's something we will be investigating too. And to clarify on the funding source, the WIFIA program, it is a bond, but it's not a bond, as I've said before, and how it acts with the city of Ashland. It's essentially a line of credit with a certain interest rate and a certain term. So when we get into the construction phase and we start building the project and the contractor invoices us, we have that $18 million of ending fund balance right now, cash on hand protection that we can use to pay the contractor. We get their invoices, we make a payment, then we ask the EPA to reimburse us that amount. And we do that through the construction portion of the project until it's completed and however much we need to spend gets spent. Now, as far as a revenue bond, typically you go out and you ask for a certain amount of money. And in this case, we would have to ensure that we have enough capacity to cover the project. So let's just say that $71 million range that we're at right now on the high end, we would go out and ask for that. They would give us that whole $71 million at one time. And the clock starts ticking at that point in time on your interest and your schedule of repayment. Whereas the WIFIA loan, you only gain interest on what you draw down from them as part of that process. The one thing that we've been struggling with is, when we had the initial discussions with WIFIA, or the EPA, excuse me, the interest rates were essentially sub 3% for the program. Over the last couple of years, things have increased dramatically. We were hoping and still hoping that we see some interest rate drops by the end of the year that will benefit that program for the city as well. So we're keeping our eye on that. And the other thing I know I've mentioned a couple times to the council is that even though we close the loan and lock in an interest rate with the EPA, we can adjust that interest rate as long as we don't make a reimbursement. So if we close and the Fed drops the interest rate, which will theoretically drop the WIFIA loan rate, and we haven't made a draw, we can lock that new reduced rate in as part of the overall program. And it gives you the additional flexibility of having another 5-year period. Revenue bond, 30 years is kind of the maximum, where the WIFIA program allows a 35-year maximum payback period for it.
Councillor Blue?
He answered my
he
question.
answered it. Councillor Hanson?
Good time. I have a timeline rundown I would like to do with the memo that you shared in the packet. Is now a good time, or should we do it later?
No, now's a good time, yep.
Okay, great. Because there was some concern that this is a project that's being fast-tracked by this council and by this mayor. And like my awareness with algae bloom, I didn't know was an issue until it was an issue. And I think members of our community who are new or now paying attention to this project are feeling that this is happening fast, that this is being rushed. But in your memo, in the packet, I encourage citizens to check it out because it gives a timeline of how this project has evolved since the master plan in 2012. It looks like there was a couple years where we don't have any documented movement on it, but then every year from 2015 to 2024, there's been multiple actions. There's been studies, there's been engineering, there's been votes for financial steps. But I just wanted to share with the community that this really is not a fast-moving project that has popped up for this council and this mayor, that this is really just what this community does: good planning, good due diligence, good research, alternatives fleshed out, and this is where we're at this point in time. Do you have anything that you want to add to that, Scott?
So I've been with the city for almost 18 years, and I can only say that we've had one project that was even remotely considered fast track, and that was the TAP project that was done in about 6 months, which is an astounding feat in and of itself. But I haven't been involved in any other project that has taken less than 1 to 3 years to get through all these steps that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. There's so many process steps that you have to do with public meetings and regulators and internal staff that it's really hard to, number one, spend the money and get through the process. It takes a lot of time.
Well, I love the conversation that's happening in the community because I think people are getting engaged and activated, and that's positive, and that's great. And I encourage people to read the packet and to join more of these conversations because it is exciting, and it's evolving. We haven't done anything beyond what we've done so far, so there's still room to get involved.
So I have a
Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'll be brief. I know the clock's ticking here. So I appreciate your explanation with the water treatment plant funding. And all of these possibilities of grants are not in place yet. They're just hopeful possibilities. And also, when I was reading on page 8 and how you mentioned that we can kind of customize the repayments of this 71, 75 million, whatever it is. Is that correct?
Through the WIFIA program,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay. And so something that I wanted to touch on, when we look at this, you said if we don't make a draw from one thing, but when we look at this, how long will it take us to pay back this bond that's not a bond?
So the WIFIA program, if we move forward with that, would be a 35-year payback with no prepayment penalty as part of that overall program. So if you did a typical bond, as I said, you would be looking at a 30-year payback period. The WIFIA program just offers you, 5 additional years in that payback period, which is one of the multiple reasons we looked at that program to begin with.
And something, because I appreciate this information you put in front of us and what our city manager pro tem had mentioned before about cost, but the water treatment plant belongs to the city, belongs to the people of Ashland, and I would really like for us to look at that 5% mills tax and have the water treatment plant, our utilities working better for the people than the people working so hard for them. But thank you, Scott.
Councilor Bloom.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and I think, it's an interesting conversation that's certainly worth having about the meals tax. But, my understanding on the timeline is that when we start talking about how we're going to pay for this, we're not looking at anything until end of the year. So something to keep in the back of our minds and have discussions about, and I'm sure there's going to be studies done on different alternatives and what we're doing, but I just want to be careful that, and again, for the community, that this council has not made any decision on how we're going to actually pay for this, right? We've not agreed on any rate increases. We've not said we're going to use this method or that method. So be patient. Again, as Councilor Hanson was pointing out, there's a process, and we're going to go through that process. And over the course of the next, 7 months, I'm sure we'll have these conversations about the meals tax, which I think is a good conversation to have, certainly.
Councilor Dale.
Thank you, Mayor. And just to piggyback on that with Councilor Duquesne, Councilor Bloom, I think indeed everyone on this council is we are all looking forward to having a very robust, very in-depth conversation about the most progressive and fair rate structure that helps. I mean, that's kind of the end that's what we get to by understanding how we get to the funding mechanism, what got us here. So I just want to back up a half step here just real quick and just to talk about the costs, because I think one of the things that I know I'm asked, and I have a lot of these discussions with community members is there's just so much information, certainly much appreciated. It's all there, right? I mean, on one hand, they say, well, we haven't been having discussions. Like, you can go back to 1991. It's there if you want to dig into it. But it is hard to digest that in 1, 2, 5 sittings. I get it. But I think one of the things that is missing that would be nice, and I know it's in there somewhere because it is. We are asking ratepayers to pay to all of our funds, and they are owed an explanation. So, with respect to the costs going up, I think without having kind of a side by side, let's just go back to 2012. I mean, to Councilor Hanson's point, I mean, what happened between 1991 and 2012? I have no idea why that got backburnered for 21 years. But just going back to what we've got here, how much of the cost is inflation adjusted, just because of the massive inflationary period that we've been in for the past 4 to 6 years? And what was an actual cost increase for, like, if you were to do it inflation adjusted? Like, was it just the one when the committee decided back to that 2016, 2017 to switch? Was that really the only one inflation adjusted cost bump to do that, and everything else has just been as planned, but due to cost increases? Or was there any kind of add-ons or things or stuff that caused? I want to separate people thinking that we just tacked things on as far as projects, and the other part was actually just monetary policy over the last 4, 6, 8 years?
So 2012 estimated cost for the project, I believe, was a little over $12 million. That was the 2.5 million gallon water treatment plant. 2016, 17, with that refreshed look, what they did as part of that study is they did an apples to apples cost comparison. Okay, what will it take generally to construct the same type of plant in a new location? So that was the $22 million cost that came out of the Black and Veatch report. So we knew that we had to put something in the budget for the project to keep moving it forward. And as I started out in the presentation, well, essentially that's a kind of a master plan feasibility look. That's your 150% swing directionally from a cost impact. Then we got into the actual engineering for the project and did the 30%. We had a cost estimate for that, the 60, 90. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about a number that came out in 2020, which is the $35 million project estimate cost, which is that between the essentially 30 and 60% design iteration. That number was from 2020. Now, essentially from 2021 to fourth quarter of 2023, construction cost index for the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Portland area is 30%. That's what it increased, just the construction cost itself. So you're looking at a 30%. I've heard other people in other locations talk about they were seeing more of a 40%, but this is kind of amortized over the Pacific Northwest region, was essentially 30% increases in cost from the inflationary metric. Not only do you have that impact, but you also have the project definition keeps getting refined as you move forward. And so you take out some of the variabilities, and that drives some of the cost changes in our location for the treatment plant. So you saw some increases to that, and I think what we often find is, you're designing a Cadillac of a facility. And what we look at is we don't want a Cadillac facility. We want the Toyota of facilities as part of that. We're looking at that middle ground where we're balancing cost of the facility with the life cycle maintenance, operational needs of it. That's what we want to see for our infrastructure, is that durable Toyota that will run forever is part of it. So that's where we get to is, we're not shiny bells and whistles from that end, as part of the design process. We just want it to work and provide the best treatment for the community that it can. So those have been the kind of the foundational increases with, I will say, and I think I've sent this out in an email to some of you maybe, the actual graphical statistic that shows, the inflation index on the construction side for the last couple of years has been pretty dramatic.
So another way to say that would be that if not for inflation, the cost within plus or minus the reasonable spec for a project would be the same now as it was then, based on what you're doing.
Yeah, within that range, correct.
Councillor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Could you back up one slide, please? Because you've led us over the course of today through the decision-making process and why we need a new water treatment plant. I think everybody, can see those reasons. But here you're talking about the funding. This slide is really about the funding, and there's lots of different options. And what we're trying to do is match the funding for construction, for capital, cost, which has to come in a fairly large chunk over a couple of years, and then it can be spread. The actual financing of that's what you do when you buy a house or something, or you buy a water treatment plant. You have a big chunk that you need to pay, and then you spread it out over a number of years. You said something that I'd like to drill down on, which is that the WIFIA loan of 35 years with no prepayment penalty, and you don't pull it all at once. You don't start paying any interest on it until you draw any of it. What that means, a draw, was if you only need, over the first year, you only need to take let's say $20 million of it, you're only paying interest on that $20 million. You're not paying on the rest of what it may eventually come up to be. Now, you said the water treatment plant, the zero, the target really is $60 million, $61 million, I think is what it said. You've got a range between 55 and 70, but really $61 million. So let's use that. I'm struck by your comment that this is flexible. It's much more flexible than any of the other options. It's more flexible than a revenue bond. You get a revenue bond, you're selling these bonds, and people buy the bonds. They expect to be paid an interest rate right from day one for the full amount. You decide how much you're going to sell in revenue bonds. You know, if you're going to go out and sell $60 million of them, you're going to be stuck with those, having to pay coupons on that for some period of time. Whereas with the WIFIA loan, you're not. The fact that there's no prepayment penalty too is if, as we get other sources to come online, like grants, next year, 2025, 2027. If there's a decision to use some of the food and beverage tax or all of the food and beverage tax at some point towards this, that's a way to repay that flexible, low interest loan, long-term loan, that you really can't do with some of these other options. So it's really you can't do that with a general obligation bond either. It's kind of complicated to pay that.
Yeah.
So it just strikes me that the WIFIA loan, and maybe I'm maybe making the obvious point, that it's really an option that leaves so many doors still open to methods for repayment over the next 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, as you're as you're undertaking construction and then going into the future. Have I missed something? Is that?
No, that's correct. I mean, you can basically cater your payment plan how you best see fit. If you want to make a balloon payment up front, you can do that. If you want to make a balloon payment at the end, you can do that. You can defer just interest-only payments for a while before you start paying principal. So it's really the buffet style of being able to get the best bang for your buck when you're looking at a funding source. As you said, you know, if we issue $61 million in just general revenue bonds for a revenue payment, we're holding $61 million cash and we're paying interest on that the whole time. Whereas we might not spend more than $1 million in a 6-month period as part of that. We did develop kind of an amortization schedule to pay the contractor, so we know when these big hits would come due as part of the financial planning side of it for the WIFIA program. So HDR helped put that together, and PFM, who's our financial consultant for the city, has helped use that information to kind of orientate the amortization schedule and what it would look like for debt payment moving forward in our discussions with the EPA.
And can I do it one more follow-on? So I see that in your slide you have under the Environmental Protection Agency WIFIA loan, you say revenue pledge for repayment, and it is a revenue pledge for repayment. Are there other instruments that could satisfy that revenue pledge for repayment?
So they accept a revenue pledge or a full faith and credit pledge for repayment of that debt. One of the reasons we stayed away from the full faith and credit pledge and just the revenue pledge is because that's a property tax basis for the whole community. And I don't know if Mary Ann's back there, but it does create certain issues for the city's ability to leverage and borrow in the future if it's a general fund debt relative to an enterprise fund debt as part of that overall process.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. We can keep going?
So one of the things that we talked about when we had the rate discussion last December was updating the 2016 cost of service study. You know, that cost of service for water creates a defensible rate structure and makes sure it's equitable across the customer classes. Everyone's paying their fair share. What the council wanted to look at was kind of updating that study and seeing how we could move some pieces around as far as charging to create a little bit more potential equity between the base meter commodity charges as part of that process. So I'm currently negotiating with HDR to provide us with a cost of service update. The goal is to have that completed by the end of the year and be able to have that document to help drive some budget questions in the next biennium as part of that process. In doing that cost of service update, one of the things that I talked to them about is incorporating the expansion of the low-income utility assistance program and kind of making a determination of what those impacts would be and the rate structure system. So they will be looking at that as part of it, the process. Then the other thing that we're currently doing right now is the council's approved construction contracts to improve the tap system. One of those projects will provide the city the ability to send water on a wholesale basis to Talent in Phoenix as an additional potential revenue source. And what I'm asking them to do is also calculate what that revenue wholesale fee would be to send water to Talent in Phoenix, during our non-peak season, which October, April, May, generally we have surplus water in our system that we can sell to Talent in Phoenix as part of our kind of overall agreement. So we're looking at that as an additional revenue addition to the structure. What would that mean as part of the overall rate structure? Again, this goes to the food and beverage discussion and using that. Those things can all be allocated into the alternatives in this cost of service study, with the primary alternative being approved by the council to move forward as that structure for guiding us specifically in the next budget period and potentially beyond from the policy standpoint.
Councillor Kaplan?
Yeah, and I guess the logic behind that possible sale of wholesale water to Talent in Phoenix is that it's running downhill from here rather than getting pumped uphill from down?
Yeah, so it's a gravity feed. Plus, we did some initial analysis and the number is significantly less. I think we're at 39 cents a thousand relative to what they would pay, which is 81 cents a thousand right now based on the commission rates in the off-peak season. So it's a big savings for them, and it's a pumping reduction as well.
Great, thank
Thanks.
you. No questions.
Are there any questions left? Councillor Hanson?
I remember on a tour, you told me you wish you had another, I forget what you said, 4 or 10 feet on the dam. And I know that the dam improvements will, I think they'll increase our capacity a little bit, but what this idea of selling water to our neighbors seems like the right thing to do if we aren't capturing the water in our dam and our neighbors need water and are buying it from Medford to do that. What will those dam improvements lend to increased capacity? So we'd have, are we going to have a bunch more water to share with our neighbors?
So we won't have a bunch more water to share with our neighbors from the storage standpoint. What we will have the ability to do is store more of it during the winter than we're currently allowed to do under our interim risk reduction measure process with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So right now, we have an agreement to buffer for some flood and high water to protect the facility. Is we operate at 60%. Depending on the outcome, and there'll be more conversations about the dam safety improvements coming forward for the council to consider from a policy and risk standpoint that could potentially reduce our capital costs in the water program as well. But it'll allow us to store more water through the winter and thus be able to provide Talent in Phoenix more water for potentially even a longer period of time.
Okay.
As part of that process. So I would put a pin in the dam safety project that right now until I can get back to the council with the outcomes of the comprehensive assessment report that we're trying to finish up right now.
Thank you.
Any final,
Just
Councillor Dale?
one last one, thank you, Mayor, is just so we're crystal clear on the next steps of communications relative, and maybe this might be for Sabrina as well, but just so the community understands, when are we going to have or scheduled rate discussions so that we can dig into that more? And how does that align with, how that You wait, Councilor Bloom. Checking. Is that how that's going to align with what next steps are? I mean, what can the community expect relative to those rate discussions, and how does that align with what we're doing?
So I expect or hope by summer, late summer potentially, to have that kind of policy framework discussion regarding the cost of service with the council and HDR. Then we will take feedback from the council, finalize that report, and bring it back and say, hey, this is what we've put together based on the analysis and the discussion. Here's what will guide us moving forward. And I wanted that to be done by the end of the year because that will help drive the budget discussion and how we develop the budget for the next biennium. And HDR has generally assured me that that schedule they can meet.
Thank you.
Any last questions or comments?
One last one.
Councillor Hanson.
Might be the last one. We didn't go over when we would like ideally to start construction. I've been asked that as well. If everything falls into place, we're looking at breaking ground 2 years from now.
So, you know, we had initially intended to close the WIFIA loan in June of this year and look at construction starting after July 1 of this year. With the referral, you know, that process has slowed us down. So I would expect construction, depending on the outcome of everything, to begin in spring of '25. And then last, like I said, about 30 months is what the anticipated schedule looks like to complete the project. And then commissioning begins after that.
Thank you. Yeah, which is potentially like 3 years from start to finish of construction to commission.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. All right. Well, both of our discussions this evening, I think, point to what it is to try to govern and provide for a community in an era of changing climate conditions, rapidly changing climate conditions. And I just want to say thank you to our staff for helping us be able to see what is coming, what is changing, how our risk is changing over time, and to how to help us as a larger community do what we need to do in order to protect our most important systems. So I know it was a long meeting tonight, but two critically important issues. And thank you so much for bringing this information to us. And with that, meeting is adjourned.
Oh, that's right.